Okay, well, welcome everybody. This is RAC meeting number 8. So we're moving right along. We got a lot more to go. Those of you I haven't met in the back, my name is Brian Keekly. I'm the facilitator today from the Langdon Group. So I'm here to provide third-party neutral facilitation for this meeting and future meetings. So why don't we get started with some introductions? We'll start with Brenda. We'll work our way around the horseshoe this way, and then we'll check and see who we have online.
All right, Brenda Smith, RAC member. Lisa Brown, RAC member with Water Watch.
Steve Rickman, RAC.
Julie Whitehall, RAC member.
Travis Singles, RAC member, irrigator.
Laura Singles, RAC member.
Barbara Howard, RAC member.
Roger Shealy, agricultural research service.
Karen Mann, RAC member and watershed council.
Mark, RAC member. Andy, RAC member. Jason Street, East Region Manager for Water Resources. I'm Tim Seymour, I'm the Assistant Manager for Groundwater Section at the Oregon Water Resources Department, based out of Colorado.
Okay, who can you identify if there's anybody online?
Yeah, Kelly, can you help out with that?
Yep, first up, Kelly Mines, Water Policy Analyst, role writer. And we have 2 RAC members on mine. I'm going to start with Brianna. Can you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Brianna O'Connor, RAC member.
And then we have Dominic Carollo representing Kristen Shellman today. Dominic, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, this is Dominic Carollo, County Counsel for Harney County, appearing for Kristen Shellman.
Thank you. Did I miss anyone else? Okay, throw it back to you.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. Let's go to the next slide. All right, you're saying. Get that, yeah, Kelly.
No.
There.
Yeah, I can take Kelly out of the one.
All right, so just a few ground rules. We go over these every time, so I think we're all on the same page, but we're here to express our viewpoints. Key pieces to treat each other respectfully. I think we always say that, and we all know that. I think it's always just worth mentioning again, particularly recognizing how hard everyone's working. I think that's one thing I'm picking up as a facilitator, and being in the middle of everything that's going on in between these meetings. I mean, there's a lot of hard work going on from the members of the RAC and of the department, so fully recognizing that everybody's working hard for an outcome here that hopefully that meets everybody's needs and being respectful of the work we're all putting into it. Just housekeeping items, if you're online, please remain muted, so we don't pick up any background interference. Use the raise hand feature if you'd like to speak online. We're operating on one screen, so when we're looking at the presentation, I can't always see who wants to speak. We'll try to get faces up there when we can, but oftentimes we'll have to have the presentation. So between Kelly and Tim, they'll let me know if you have a question. If you're in person, again, also raise your hand if you'd like. I mean, we don't have a huge group today, and they do go pretty smoothly, but it's always helpful if a lot of people have comments or questions on any particular topic. That helps me track the order in which you indicated it, so I can make sure you get those out. RAC only participates in the RAC meeting. That's all of you here, and the public is here as observers, but also we have comment periods set aside. So we'll have 2 different comment periods, and we'll check, I guess, just right off the top, show of hands who would like to provide comment, if anybody here does. Okay. So 1, it's just good for me to know at a time. And online, if you're a member of the public and want to provide comment, raise your hand, we'll track that.
Drop a note in the chat.
Yeah, or drop a note in the chat. Okay, questions about ground rules? Okay, moving right along. So operating guidelines, this is just kind of clearly identifying the roles we have here. The RAC role, attend and participate in the meetings. Provide input and advice, and help the department consider various perspectives. Public's role, listen during the presentation, the RAC discussions, and then provide advice during that designated comment time. The role of the department is to foster a space for that meaningful dialogue and conversation, consider the feedback of the RAC, and draft the final rules. And then my job is to, again, is also foster that meaningful dialogue and conversation by everybody, to help ensure you all have the opportunity to participate. And ensure that this is a safe space where you are free to express your viewpoints and, we're respectful of each other. Okay, so the agenda for today. The first thing we're gonna do is present on the Division 10 groundwater report, and I'll share, kick that off. So we're gonna kind of implement a process moving forward at the top of each agenda item. So I'll show you what that looks like when we get to the Division 10 groundwater report. We'll do public comment at that time. So we have one right now indicated they would like to provide comment. We want to make sure do a comment earlier in the day so that if then you would like to leave, you have the opportunity to. We're going to look at RAC decision points. So this would be an opportunity to really look at the map, draft a map, so to speak, of different, where the different topics will fall into the future RAC meetings. We need to get a sense from the RAC at that time. Do we got this right? Is this the right order? Are we missing anything? So really helping us dial in the schedule moving forward. We'll spend a little bit of time on milestone checks, so specifically classification and the swamp boundaries. Those are things that we want to be able to dial in and have a degree of understanding on so that we can continue on some of these next steps. So a lot of these steps have to happen in sort of iterative process. Take a break. Then we'll update the RAC process. There's some new ideas that we have about how we can provide you the opportunity to get engaged and participate in this RAC process. So we'll introduce that idea and then dive back into those future topics and really dissect what do we need to do to prepare for those? What information do you need? What information does the department need to be working on? Because moving forward, these topics are going to take a lot of work. We need to get the ball rolling and the department working on the things that you're going to need ahead of time. So we want to make sure they're working on the right stuff. Then another public comment period of time if there is any next steps and action items. Any questions? Okay. So goals today, introduce that Division 10 groundwater report, gather input on proposed rulemaking milestones or the scope, so to speak. Introduce the opportunity for outside discussion groups. That's what I was alluding to, is what we might be able to introduce here coming up. Build a shared understanding around swamp and classification boundaries, and gather feedback to prepare those future meeting topics and determine the level of discussion group each one of those will warrant. So a lot of conversation about planning and how we're setting ourselves up for success moving forward. Okay, next. Okay, so let's go to the next slide here. So this is what I wanted to introduce. Last meeting, we talked about that International Association of Public Participation Spectrum. It's back there in the room in the back on the easel there, but it was helpful for us, I think, in that last meeting to really get into, what are the different levels of engagement in each one of these topic areas. So what we'll do is kind of at the top of every topic area, this slide will look the same. We'll do this moving forward. We'll talk about the goal for the conversations. So the goal questions that we anticipate answering as part of the presentation. And the level of participation and it falls into that IEP2 spectrum. So just try to set the stage for each topic area. So for the Division 10 groundwater report, we want to introduce this report and discuss next steps. So this just arrived in your email box a couple days ago. That's, the department's been working on this for a long time and that was when it was available. So I didn't want to conflate that release of that report with today's meeting. The timing of that didn't really necessarily mean we need to have this report digested for this meeting today. More or less, we got it to you as soon as we could. The public comment period associated with this, because it's its own process, and Tim will explain more about that, doesn't start until the 1st of July. So you're really getting sort of the preview. But what we want to be able to do today is introduce it, help everybody understand it, but not, there's plenty of time to dig into it. And we can revisit it again in August if there's questions and things that you have that you kind of discover over the next, X amount of time. But the opportunity to provide public comment on this, because it does have its own public comment period time, my understanding goes through the end of the rules, so. A lot of time with this, but it's, we wanted to get it to you as soon as possible, so that's why you got it a couple days ago. The questions to be answered. So what we tried to do, there was a number of questions that were provided to the department from some members of the RAC and other questions that we've come up with that would be helpful to know. So we took all those questions that were provided to us. We'll continue looking towards that so that when we go to a new topic area, we can pull the questions out and say, well, within the context of this presentation or discussion, we'll address that. So if those of you that saw that document where it's kind of an FAQ document, trying to pull some of those questions out of there and also add questions that make sense to answer part of this. And then level of participation. So in this sense, it's consult. It's pretty, again, this is a report that's being put out to the public for feedback. It's a culmination of a lot of work. It's separate in a way from the RAC, but it helps inform the RAC. So it's really, this is feedback as part of the comment period. Any questions? Just before we kick this off? Okay. I'll turn it over to Tim.
Thanks, Brian. So groundwater report requirements. So to try to put this in like perspective of our rule requirements for how we go about designating a critical groundwater area. We call them our Division 10 rules. It's Oregon Administrative Rule, Chapter 690, Division 10, lays out a process by which we go through to designate a critical groundwater area. One of the requirements that was written into those rules, as they were recently updated, is that we will produce a groundwater report that does three things. It identifies the criteria that were met under the statute that allows designation of critical groundwater area. We identify and characterize the groundwater reservoir or reservoirs subject to the proposed critical groundwater area designation. And then we identify corrective control measures that are likely to resolve the problem. So essentially, this is a problem statement report with the added piece of, and here's what we think we need to do to solve it. We don't get into why we think we need to do these things to solve it, but it lists out what we intend to investigate and look at as we move forward. All of this must be supported by substantial evidence. And so everything in the report has been well documented and backed up with years of scientific work. So the groundwater study and that investigation that went on for 6 years with USGS, all of the water level data collected by WRD, everything has been vetted, quality controlled to make sure that we meet this substantial evidence requirement. And so I just want to highlight that this substantial evidence piece is very important to us. And so the data we present has to meet a certain level of rigor, scientific rigor, in order to be used. So that's the need for the report. So some key takeaways from it right off the bat is the groundwater within the basin is hydraulically connected. It's one system. The second point is that 2 statutory criteria for designating a critical groundwater area have been met. The first one is a 2-parter. So groundwater levels have declined excessively, which means there's over 50 feet of decline from highest known levels. And the groundwater levels are excessively declining, which means that over a 10-year period in some wells, we have seen 3 feet of decline per year or more. So there's a magnitude, how far have we gone down criteria there? And there's also a rate. So how steeply are we going down in groundwater levels? And so both of those pieces have been triggered within that one criteria. The second one is that the available groundwater supply is being or is about to be overdrawn. And overdrawn is defined in our rules as actual pumping in a year exceeds actual recharge within that area. And so we've exceeded that as well. And we'll dig into both of these more as we go forward. And then the last is WRD is going to proposed 4 corrective control provisions, which we believe are likely to help resolve this problem. So those are the essentially 3 criteria that we have to meet, right? This is what we're gonna present, and these are the key takeaways. So this is what I hope you get as we continue to move through the presentation. So identifying and characterizing the groundwater reservoir, right? So what are we actually talking about? Where are we talking about? So on the left, I've got a map there of the Harney Basin groundwater study area. So this was the area that was investigated as part of the groundwater study. And that groundwater study that was published in 2022 is really the basis for all of the most of the information in this report for the identification and characterization of the groundwater reservoir. Harney Basin is roughly 5,240 square miles in size. And a key point, which is called out in the groundwater study, is that, and I know you've asked before, Mark, but it's on page 65 of that, where it says that groundwater in the Harney Basin occurs within a single groundwater flow system that includes several distinct yet hydraulically connected areas, distinguished by local geology, location and basin-wide groundwater flow system, and local rate and magnitude of recharge and discharge. So in simpler terms, right, because that's the USGS's scientific language, is that basically groundwater throughout the basin is connected. So there are no barriers to flow. Groundwater occurs in multiple hydraulically connected geologic units. So think rocks, right? And there are different rocks throughout the basin. And some rocks, like water moving through certain types of rocks, behave differently than in other types of rocks. And when I say behave, I mean the speed of movement and the quantity of water that can be stored within those rocks. So depending on the geology, you may have more or less water in storage, and water may move faster or slower through those rocks. And so we've got a complicated system, but it is all one system. And then the last piece here is rates and magnitudes of recharge and discharge vary based on location. So recharge is water coming into the system. So that's generally precipitation through either rain or snow. And then that goes into the ground and becomes part of the groundwater system. Discharge is natural discharge through springs and streams, through groundwater dependent ecosystems, native vegetation, think like your greasewood, things like that actually reach down into the groundwater system. They consume that water and use it. And then the other piece of discharge is actual pumping. So Mark, I saw you had your hand up. Did you?
It's probably, we're probably just gonna disagree on this one, Tim. I mean, groundwater flow system. Steve said it's all hydraulically connected. To me, that doesn't mean it's the same groundwater continuity, however you want to say it. So I mean,
Great. So are you saying you disagree that it isn't the same groundwater reservoir?
Yeah.
Okay.
and I think that has some great implications in volunteer agreements when you look at the volunteer agreement section. So that's my major concern. I've said before, I'll say it again.
Okay. Thank you for that. So that's the groundwater reservoir as is presented in this report. To dig a little bit more into the rocks or the geology, on the left here, there's a map. We talked about it a lot in the model conversation earlier today. But this is, the geologic structure of the basin. And this is more of the superficial geology, but basically the key takeaway here is you got a bunch of different colors and each color represents different types of rocks, which means groundwater behaves differently in each of those areas. So it moves faster or slower, and there's more or less actual storage in those areas. But at the end of the day, groundwater moves throughout that entire system. And then on the right here, we've got an example that's really simple and straightforward to understand how groundwater moves across those different types of material. So the tan material around the outside is a much lower permeability. Water moves slower. There's less of it in storage there. And the red in the middle is really high permeability material. So water moves very quickly through it. And there's generally more in storage there. And so when you pump from the red area, you're able to produce lots of water in a well. When you pump from the tan area, you're able to produce substantially less. And why that's important is that as you pump in that red area, you can draw groundwater levels down faster than you can by pumping in the tan area. And in this case, and this is a cross section, so you'd have to think of this in 3 dimensions as like a big area. But water has to flow through the tan areas to get into the red area. So you're able to extract much faster in that red area than water can flow in from the tan area. And that results in timing implications here. So how fast recharge gets to the red area is dictated by where the recharge is coming from and how much of that tan material the water would have to move through in order to get to that red area. And so this is how the geology informs our decision-making around what we're gonna do from a management perspective. But all that is then characterized in the groundwater report there. So any questions on the groundwater reservoir before we jump into the statutory criteria that have been met? Okay. Hopefully a lot of that is reviewed because we've talked about that many times. So groundwater levels have declined excessively. So that declined excessively is defined as greater than 50 feet of decline from the highest known levels. So we looked at wells throughout the basin and we identified where we had highest known levels, where we had good data that we felt met our level of scientific rigor, and used those and have plotted them up here on the left in this map. And you can see that Weaver Springs is down there in that cone of compression, big grouping of red dots down there in the bottom left. But then we have others in other areas as well, up through Crane and then up into the north of Highway 20 area. And so a couple things I want to point out here are that we don't have more wells on this map because of a lack of historic measurements and because of a lack of current measurements. So in order to be able to evaluate this, you have to have a longer period of record to understand what has happened. And to actually capture the decline from previous levels to current levels. And so just because there aren't more dots up there doesn't mean that there aren't more wells in these areas that have likely experienced the same kind of decline. We simply can't evaluate it because we don't have the data. And so if we were to have more data, we would likely see more wells. The other thing is that more wells are expected to reach this threshold within several years based on our current rates of decline and based on our current measurements. And we're establishing a longer period of record, and therefore we're able to capture and actually evaluate based on that. So that's one part of the statutory criteria for water level decline.
This message from Kelly.
Oh, shoot, am I not? Kelly, can you not see the,
No, we can see you. Yes,
can you see the presentation?
I can see the presentation. Yes.
Yeah, I can see it. It looks good.
This was a little bit old, sorry. I just saw it.
It's all right.
Are you recording?
Yeah, I believe we are recording, right? Kelly?
Yep, we're recording. Oh, this is a good
Great.
group check, everybody. Good job. Yep, we're good.
I'd hate to have to say this all again. So the second piece here is groundwater levels are excessively declining. So that, as I said, is a rate-based definition. It means that we have decline rates of at least 3 feet per year for at least 10 years. So that's a pretty steep decline in groundwater levels. Again, the number of wells that meet this threshold is limited by a lack of current measurements. So the trend, we have to have 10 years of data in which to evaluate that trend. And then that trend has to, for our purposes here, we were looking at that trend using more recent data. So we're not looking back to 1970. We're looking at what's happening in the last 20, 30 years and identifying areas. So again, we're limited by the data we have. And we expect that more wells will reach this threshold within the next several years, based on our current data collection and based on the current rates of decline in some of the wells we're monitoring that haven't tripped this threshold yet, most likely because they haven't reached 10 years of data. And so once we reach 10 years of data, we'll have tripped this threshold. But you can see again, Weaver Springs is a hotspot. We've got areas around Crane, in the lawn area, and then again, going up to the north of Highway 20. And then there's the one sort of in the middle there. So these are the wells we evaluated. And we list them all, and they're links to hydrographs on our groundwater information system within the report. So you can go in and actually look at what wells specifically we evaluated. You can go look at their hydrographs. You can confirm that we did our calculations right and we actually are being transparent.
Tim,
Yeah,
might be redundant, but, so the first two triggers, none of them have happened down the Donner Blister in the south area?
these are the wells that we have evaluated.
So I
Well,
just,
why haven't you evaluated the balance? You know what I'm saying? I mean, why haven't you evaluated Donner Woodson?
We have, and we don't have any that have met this
got it,
threshold.
okay.
so that's
Yeah.
why they're not, that's why
That's what-
it's not even on the map.
What's on the map is what we have evaluated that has met this threshold. Same with the previous map. Yep. Any other questions on decline, excessively declined or declining excessively, or excessively declining, however you say it? John?
So then maybe you're getting to that, so why would Donner and Blitzen be included in the swamp vote?
We'll get there. If you can, yep, totally agree. Overdrawn. So this is the second statutory criteria we've met. And overdraw, this is the actual definition from rule, but it basically means to artificially produce water or pump in any 1 year period from a groundwater reservoir or part of that reservoir at an annual rate that exceeds the average annual recharge. So basically, are you pumping more than is coming in within an area? This does not consider natural discharge to springs, streams, and native vegetation. So we are not including evapotranspiration to native vegetation. We're not including spring flow. We're not including stream flow in this calculation. That means pumping exceeds recharge, which in the long term would mean pumping would capture all water being used by native vegetation, streams, and springs. So there would be no groundwater contribution to those three things if we allowed an overdrawn system to continue unchecked indefinitely. We would eventually use up all of the recharge to the point at which native vegetation has no water, streams and springs have no groundwater component to their flow. Fred?
Caveat would be for that specific aquifer.
Can you elaborate a little more?
When you look at a spring or a stream, you have a long linear and vertical, call it an aquifer
Sure.
that has both surface and subsurface discharges which seasonally change. So when you say overdrawn, then you're defining a specific aquifer that is only looking at the subsurface for that particular aquifer.
So what we're looking at when we're looking at overdrawn, what I was trying to highlight here with not considering natural discharge is that groundwater contributes to spring flow, stream flow, and native vegetation. And you're absolutely right that a stream is generally long and linear, and that a groundwater reservoir or an aquifer often contributes along different portions of that. And in some places, it contributes to the stream flow. In other places, it accepts recharge from the stream flow. And stream flow varies based on seasonality, right? So in the spring, you got snow melt, you have good runoff. There's much more coming down the stream than is just what is coming from groundwater contributions. But in the summer, when snow melt is completely run off, most or potentially all of the water is coming from groundwater leaking into that stream and driving that stream flow. And so if we are pumping more than is being recharged in an area, it is possible and even likely that you will reach a point where groundwater pumping results in that stream going dry, whereas previously it may have been perennial and run all year because groundwater was contributing water to it during the summer months.
At that particular point.
At that particular point, yes. And so what I'm trying to stress here is overdrawn is a really bad situation for natural conditions. So there's springs, streams, and native vegetation take a serious impact when we're overdrawn because we're consuming all of the water in that system that was coming in with groundwater pumping.
Mark's got his hand.
Oh, sorry, Mark.
No problem, Tim. So just point of clarification. So on page 65, it talks about a single groundwater system. Is it the department's opinion that it means it's all one aquifer?
We are considering it one groundwater reservoir. I think aquifer can be a challenging term from our perspective because it's defined oftentimes in different ways, but essentially, yes, it's one aquifer because everything is connected.
So the groundwater flow system, in the department's opinion, there's one.
It's one groundwater reservoir, so we state in this report.
But in RAC number 2, you said that the groundwater reservoir is ambiguous and hard to define. So are you defining it as one aquifer?
Yes. So in order to evaluate overdrawn, we have to have essentially a water budget or an amount of recharge occurring. And in the groundwater study, the USGS and WRD together works to break the study into, or the Hardy Basin into 3 study areas from a water budget perspective. We have a northern area, a western area, and a southern area. And this was for simplifying the water budget accounting. Because each one of these, you can see, lines up fairly closely with the 3 major drainages, right? You've got the Sylvies, Silver Creek, and the Donner Blitzen. And the goal here is to identify how much recharge is coming into that area so that we can then compare it to pumpage. And so we then did that. So in the groundwater study, we went through and we identified and came up with pumpage values for 2017 and 2018. We used the mean of those 2. And so here we've got the 3 water budget regions and then the basin. We've got the mean annual lowland recharge, since that's where the majority of the pumping is. And by majority, I really mean like 99.9% of pumping. We've got the total mean pumpage, and then we've got the difference. And I highlighted where we're overdrawn, and I've highlighted where we believe we're about to be overdrawn. And so the northern region is overdrawn in that pumping exceeds recharge on an annual basis. And in the western region, we're 4,500 acre feet away from overdrawn. When we look at this water budget accounting as compared to authorized use, so what's been authorized in paper water right, you can see that the northern region is actually, if we were to pump what we have permitted, 96,000 acre feet out of balance. The western region is 18,000 acre feet out of balance, and the Harney Basin as a whole is about 104,000 acre feet overdrawn. So, Mark.
But that's paper water rights, not actually 2018 usage, correct?
Correct. The 2018 usage is right there in the middle highlighted.
Second question. So once again, the southern region or the Donner Blitzen region has not triggered this threshold.
Correct. Yep.
Can I ask a question about that though? But in some parts it has, right? I mean, Sod House Springs dried up from pumping probably, right? So that overdrawn right there.
I haven't seen any slide presentation that says anything of the southern region has tripped any of the thresholds.
Or we talked about it this morning,
That's right.
but we didn't talk about it this morning, right? I mean,
Oh, yeah, I mean, Steve did say that he thought one of the contributing factors to Sod House Springs was the pivot south of it.
Any other questions from the RAC on this table? So, the statutory criteria have been met, so, and where, right? That's what I'm trying to summarize here. So groundwater levels have declined excessively or are excessively declining in 5 of the sub areas we've talked about previously. I tried to put this in the sub area conversation because in that framework, because that's what we've been talking about for 5 or so racks now. And I think it's helpful, to help dial in exactly where those areas are. So Crane, Lawn, North Harney, Rock Creek, Weaver Springs have all tripped. Dog Mountain, we expect to trip in the next 2 to 3 years. Based on current rates of decline and magnitudes. It's possible it has already tripped and we simply don't have the data, but I can't, like, that is pure speculation. So we believe in 2 to 3 years it will trip as well.
Tim,
Yeah,
are there areas that are shown on the map of excessively decline that are not in one of those 6 areas?
They're not what, one?
no, every sub area listed here
Are you sure?
has,
Are there areas in the map that show excessively decline? That are not in one of those 6 areas?
not to my knowledge. So I listed all the sub areas that we evaluated.
There are.
Where?
I'll show you the map. Okay. It's between Crane and Lawn.
Tell you where it is.
Yeah.
Joe?
I'm curious, I'm confused as to why lawn is on there when, gosh, even the map Steve showed today didn't show lawn as a problem.
So Lawn has 1,
Oh,
and
okay.
so the 3 between Lawn and Crane do not show up in any of your excessively declining areas.
Not based on this report.
So I'm just saying, the 3 red dots there between Crane and Lawn do not show up in those 6 sub areas that you just listed on the next slide.
I am pretty sure they're,
I could be,
but. I mean, I could have totally watched it there, in which case they're in Crane Buchanan, so.
That wouldn't be Crane Buchanan.
They're in the Crane County some area.
All right, back to statutory criteria now. So the second one is the available groundwater supply is or is about to be overdrawn in 2 of the 3 water budget regions. So the northern region is overdrawn, western region is within 4,500 acre feet of being overdrawn. Authorized use in both of those vastly exceeds overdrawn. And so there's 13 of 15 sub areas are or about to be overdrawn. And lower Blitzen voltage and upper Blitzen are the 2 which are not in an overdrawn water budget region. So again, coming back to Mark's point, he said it multiple times, that southern water budget region is not overdrawn, and the 2 sub areas within that are not overdrawn.
Tim, question.
So really, the western region is not overdrawn, it's barely above. It doesn't quite meet the criteria. Right, because it's in the plus 400,000,
We believe it is about to be overdrawn.
about to be, but the criteria, your ordinances don't say about. And my other question would be, that's just, I guess, a comment. My other question is, so we're applying these, the statutory criteria to designate critical groundwater area. And in one scenario, you used the whole basin, you used all the 50-foot drawdown, and you put the whole basin in, even though it was only in one area, but in the next, the overdrawn part, you divided this up into your drainage basin. So are we gonna apply criteria for these rules as a basin, or are we allowed to divide them up and use criteria in sub-basins and all this? See what I'm saying? You apply them 2 different ways.
So I would not say that we applied like,
Well, you broke this up into different areas.
we broke it
to
up in.
apply them,
We
yeah.
broke it up into water budget regions because that's the format in which we have the information. I can't divide this water budget into different areas because we don't have that information. This is what the study provided us. And this is the framework we have to work in order to do this evaluation. And I understand that that is frustrating, but that is the best science we have at this point. From a overarching standpoint, what we're gonna get to is that the statutory criteria for overdrawn say, if any, I was trying to find it again. That's the definition of overdrawn, and then it is the available groundwater supply is being or is about to be overdrawn. That is the exact statutory criteria. So if it is or is about to be. And then when we talk about overdrawn, we talk about in any 1 year period from a groundwater reservoir or part thereof at an annual rate. And that allows us to look at parts of a groundwater reservoir and not the entire reservoir as a whole. And that's the framework in which we worked in order to apply the water budget to the pumping to be able to understand that it was overdrawn.
Mark, so if there's no more pumping going to happen in the western area, because there's no more permits that are gonna be established, how will it exceed it?
That number right there
That's
is,
paper water, right, like
That's
we talked
paper.
about?
which is authorized and can be pumped at any moment.
So if we got rid of paper water right, then it couldn't be potential to be overdrawn.
If we got this number to 0, I would agree that we are not about to be overdrawn, because it would be impossible to pump more. Now, that said, recharge can change over time.
Static.
But also, that's 2018. We're in 2024. If you look at those wells north of Riley, my guess is we've gotten a lot closer to that number by now, right? I mean,
But this is the water budget, not the excessively declined. This is overdrawn. So unless they're pumping more water than we're pumping to do that.
yeah, right. I think they probably are.
So Larissa's got her hand up.
I would say there's probably less water being pumped now since 2018 because Weaver has been drying up and they're part of our western region, so we are probably even. Does that make? I
Yeah,
mean,
the
there's
soil
less-
profile
there's less-
Way better
there's
today than
A
it
lot
was.
more dried up pivots since 2018, that's 6 years ago in Weaver. You could probably find that out easy, so that number is probably even higher.
And there's a lot of effort put in the
Yeah.
deep systems where we're trying to conserve
Right.
water.
Could be some
So-
conserved water.
As I said at the beginning, this is our best scientific
Yeah.
data at this point. I do not have peer-reviewed information that allows me to show any different numbers than this. And so this is what we have to work with. So Roger,
I just wondered, I don't know how useful this light logic is, but are there any of the monitoring wells that have increased in water?
in the last year, we have had a couple of wells close to the Sylvies rebound small amounts.
Yes.
Nothing compared to the long decadal downswing in water levels.
Okay, so at some point, if you can find wells that continue to decrease, there's an offset for wells that you're saying are decreasing. If it's one unit, then there's an increase in water in a couple of wells. If that happened more, then that would offset, that would be explaining where the water went for somebody else's. Is that right?
So if we have increasing water levels in one area, that means we received more recharge than past years in that specific area. We have not seen that then cascade out over a broader area.
No, but that explains where the water that you lost, that you're over pumping, where it actually went, didn't go through an irrigation pipe.
I'm not sure I follow.
Okay, it's probably based on that idea that there's only a couple wells that have ever increased for a couple of years, it's probably not worth pursuing at this point, but, it's a point. If there are wells that are increasing, as they offset wells that are decreasing, because it's one big basin, you say, so. That's all.
Yep. Andy,
How many acres were you irrigating, you know, with your mapping with that 80,700 acre feet of water?
I don't have that number in front of me, so
It's alive?
It's in the report, yeah. I don't know that it's in this report, it's in our groundwater study where we got the pumpage data, so there's
I
a.
do the math on paper, but I was trying to figure out what the wet was.
You can get real close, Andy, by taking the 80,700 and dividing it by 2.42.
That's kind of the number to that.
So that talks through the two statutory criteria that have been tried and or met. It's the department's opinion that we need to designate the entire basin a critical groundwater area because of the ongoing conditions across the basin. There is no sub area where we do not have declines occurring. The entire basin is one hydraulically connected groundwater flow system that is both overdrawn in parts of it or about to be overdrawn, and where we have excessively declining wells. And there are a myriad of reasons why managing it as a whole is important. I think one of the most poignant for me is we know that there are transfers occurring. There's further development happening in that southern region. And we're adding on water use or moving water use from parts of the basin to other parts of the basin. And as we see that happen, and we already have declines in these areas, we are going to see thresholds tripped in the future in these other two sub areas, the lower Blitzen voltage and the upper Blitzen. I cannot say how long it will take, but I believe that we need to manage it as a whole and prevent further development and investment in groundwater in those areas that we would only have to come back and potentially address at a later date. And so that is why we want to manage the basin as a whole. So John.
You guys did stop transfers going in and out of different regions. I can look it up, 2018, maybe you don't off the top of your head, but they've been stopped for a long time. And so any transfers since then that, I mean, there's very few, they have been they've been in the same little area of voltage as an example for Anderson Valley or that kind of thing. It has not been from one region to another. They've been seen as different sources, however you want to say it, but
Right.
That's not true.
We have done our best to prevent that. We may not always be successful. That's the thing, right? So transfer, like we get protests on transfers on a fairly regular basis. That may not always be the case.
Farms up ahead of me.
So two questions. In rules, if you did not designate the two sub areas, they're not overdrawn, could you not allow transfers to go into those from other areas?
Our basin program rules cannot affect our transfer rules. Is what I've been told.
Second question, of those two sub areas that haven't met those criteria, with the groundwater allocation rulemaking, would they still be in a threshold in the rest of the state where water allocations would still be occurring? 25-foot decline, half a foot a year.
Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head, and we would have to get back to you.
If you could get back to me, that'd be great.
They actually, that transfer wouldn't be possible because they'd be seen as separate sources, right? Or different sources. you can do a transfer as long as it's the same source, and if I pull from Sawdust Springs, and there's no way I can transfer to Silver Creek, because that seems as a different source. That was the basis of OWP stopping the transfers.
Right. So we've done our best to prevent long distance transfers, yes. Russ,
So I'm having a little hard time visualizing that area, John. I don't see how it would be possible, as an example, in the Donner Blitzen lower voltage, to do a transfer that would affect the quantity impacting the budget. Maybe I'm not seeing it clearly, but there's a number of transfers that were stopped clear out of the area. There was some that were stopped that were within the area, but can't remember what reason. So, if you looked at the paper, are we looking at the paper certificates versus the active use on that transfer? I mean, I'm having a hard time seeing any quantity change that would affect what we're talking about.
Well, I guess what I'm saying to Tim, and probably what Mark and I are, I think, on the same direction here. Why would we be including the west side and the south side in Swampa? That's not a reason, because it's not happening. The transfers from let's say the north into the west does not happen. Transfers from the north into the south does not happen. That's all I'm saying. It's not a reason to include them in Swampa.
critical groundwater.
Okay, critical ground, Mark's gonna be straight.
But that's my point too, so, that makes sense.
Going back to this slide, we have 10,000 acre feet of pumping that hasn't been developed yet. And we already have finding groundwater levels in that southern region. And as we talked about in the mall conversation, the deeper a hole gets in, say, the Weaver Springs area or other locations, the more that is going to pull groundwater from these other regions. And we can test this with the model. I mean, we'll be able to look at some of that and see what the effect is and what the timing is. And we want to get there. I guess at the end of the day, what I'm trying to say is this is the backing for this. And I'm about to get to the next steps on how you can publicly comment on this and how that comment is then going to get used. And Roger, did you have a
I
question?
just have something off the beat, but you know, I have, I'm selling my stuff and I have a pivot that has been increasing its water table since I bought it, a static water. But by putting it in the Swampa, you reduce the value of that property substantially, when in fact, that's not the true story.
By putting it in the critical area?
Yeah. And I think that needs to be considered, because a lot of our land isn't in there yet. And we may want to sell, and like putting it in there without having met the criteria, there's some liability issues associated with real estate value.
Thank you for that feedback.
So Tim, I have a question. It's a common thing. To me, how come you just don't go turn off the 100 junior well, then it all just comes back? The last 100 that was drilled, let's go turn them off. I own some of them.
Because we can't do that without a critical groundwater area designation.
Why? They hit the triggers.
So we have talked about enforcing on permit decline conditions, and that's a different issue, and that falls outside what we're talking about here, Andy. But what we said in the last RAC meeting is that we are evaluating that, and we intend to move forward with that kind of regulation. However, that does not, like, we're still trying to understand how many acre feet that would be and where that would be. Because it's very possible that permit decline condition enforcement is not going to get us what we need in order to stabilize groundwater levels. But we are still working on that evaluation. But yes, that is something we're pursuing this forward with.
I say,
When we bought our property, we bought them based on that.
I say one thing, I've been in real estate here for 34 years, and I have to agree with Roger. By designated areas that don't meet the criteria, it's critical. You are gonna be in these ranches. You're gonna do an economic hardship against them, you know, if it doesn't meet the criteria.
I think that's a really great, sorry to interrupt, I think it's a really great comment. I think that kind of comment is what we're looking for when we talk about the physical impact statement. And it's certainly something we need to conclude within writing rules and considering critical groundwater designation, which we'll be talking about a little bit later, that physical impact statement. So just want to chime in here. I think those are good comments. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's two key points here. What Kelly made, and also comments on this are important and needed. But if we don't get the comments in the right context in a comment period, then it's difficult to.
well, and what I was really saying is, when you look at your chart, if you go turn off that much water, then it's all hydraulically connected. Why doesn't it fix the problem?
Because it depends on timing. Right, so we saw in the model that turning off all pumping didn't solve the problem for some areas for 40 to 60 years. And so turning off a small amount of pumping, they shouldn't use like small. Turning off pumping in one area does not necessarily mean it is going to cascade across in a timely fashion to another area.
But you use it the other way in your other conversation, Tim, like we said for a year, you use it standard both ways. So I mean, we're gonna declare Dollar Woods a critical groundwater destination because of affecting Weaver Springs get affected. But not in a timely fashion. So if you use timely fashion on one side, you should use timely fashion on the other side. You're not consistent.
That's fair criticism. Thanks, Mark.
And
Brett.
in the earlier studies on the base, they drilled 6 wells in the Niagara Lake area to determine the impact on the lake area itself towards the water table in both north and south, and either positive or negative effect. And their determination was that Malheur Lake, once the water gets in Malheur Lake, it neither impacted in a positive way nor a negative way groundwater levels to the north or south. That was the results of that study. And it was based on 6 wells, core drills at that time. And in summary, it said 85% of the water, once it gets to Malheur Lake, is lost due to evaporation. But that it neither affected positive or negative the groundwater. That's why I've always said that there's big separations. Now you can go theoretical and talk about all waters connected even through hard and permeable rock. I understand the concept. It's not practical. The aquifers where there's water movement that's measurable it makes much more sense to me. But that's why when you say Weaver Springs is gonna pull water from the south across that big glob of clay, and that we don't even know how deep some of that clay is, hundreds and hundreds of feet deep, maybe thousands. We don't know. There's breaks in it, hydrogeological. But anyway, I'm just making that point that water passage to be realistic, there must be a link, there must be a measured link, in my view.
Okay, so we got one here, and then I just, in just 1 second, just a reminder that, we're gonna spend a lot of time today identifying where we can drill down further and how we can maybe utilize some different formats to do that. So keep that in mind, because some of this can fold into some of that. And also keep in mind, this is a, you know, report that's out there we're introducing today. We'll be able to continue revisiting and talking about.
So the department has suggested to divide us into sub areas for management and regulatory, to regulate us, and they want to regulate us different by sub areas. And so, because water resource has said that they see the difference is from area to area and how water response or, our different criteria, geology, or whatever we want to apply to it. So we're gonna be divided and being, treated according to water issues, responses, whatever. So why can't we apply that same criteria of designation by sub area to see if that sub area meets the critical designation, if we're gonna be regulated differently? You put the western with Weaver. We all know Weaver is the worst area as far as issues. And if Weaver, let's just an example, gets regulated off, well, that's now gonna affect that whole region's recharge numbers and what it's available, or, I'm just saying that if we're gonna divide and we're going to regulate different, then we see the differences in those sub areas to do that. So why aren't we applying the criteria for the designations the same way as we're gonna regulate? That would be my comments.
Tell me if I'm getting this accurate. They'll just say it again. We're gonna talk about modeling later, correct? And we're gonna identify what scenarios could be modeled. So there's room to.
I think what I
different things.
heard, and correct me if I'm here, Larissa, but I think what I heard is you would prefer that if we're gonna say that the basin is one unit, we should manage it as one unit. If we're gonna divide it up, then we should leave out the areas that haven't tripped threshold.
Possibly,
Okay.
we're gonna be.
That's fine,
No,
that's
if we're
fine.
different, If we're different, we're different. If we're not, we're not.
Alright,
And I
So
think
I'll
it's,
move on.
I think it's important, Tim, to kind of point out too, that, I'm hearing a lot of comments around Donner and Blitzen and why are they in the critical groundwater area? And really, when you start talking about these management scenarios, we're gonna be talking about, just a preview, how much, when, and where, right? So when we're talking about where, talking about delineating or dividing up the critical ground, critical groundwater, whatever it may be, into certain areas. And maybe a management scenario is, let's leave out Donner and Blitzen and see if we can meet our goals for the groundwater, stabilizing groundwater levels. So I think there's just a lot of time to incorporate this feedback in. And I just think it's kind of important.
thanks, Kelly. So moving on, here are the 4 corrective control measures that are likely to resolve the problems. These are direct from rule and statute. So the first one's a provision closing the area to any further appropriation. So classification does not prevent us from accepting applications. It only helps us in denying applications. In a critical area, we can actually outright deny an application. It's a weird quirk of the way the rules around allocation are written. But that's the reason for that first one, is we can just outright deny an application for new groundwater. The second one is determining what to do with any application that exists at the time when we start the rulemaking or that comes in during that. Likely, we don't have any of those because the Greater Harney Valley groundwater area of concern was already classified, and that has prevented most new applications from coming in. The next one is, as we've talked about before, provision determining the annual permissible total withdrawal, and that could be annual or it could be on a more granular timescale. But we've chosen to really focus on annual, and that's the PTW. So how much can be pumped and where? And then the last one is we have this very broad corrective control provision that allows any one or more provisions that are necessary to protect the public welfare, health, and safety. And we added that one in so that we could address other potential issues related to well construction, or other items that may come up as we go through this process. We didn't want to leave that out because we want to be able to have that broad power to deal with a specific, unique situation if we have one. And so those are the four that we believe are likely to help resolve the issue. And that's what we intend to discuss as we go through the whole week. Couple here.
So I understand, like, I think we would all agree that we don't want any further development. So I understand why you want the critical groundwater, so we don't do that. But what is a moratorium? Can't you do a moratorium? I know like Christmas Valley has one. What is a moratorium? Can they even apply for permits? I mean, they're not gonna get them. Is that why we won't want to do a moratorium instead? Because you can write it in rule. We wrote it in the first RAC back in 2016. We wrote that no more development was gonna occur. We didn't have to be designated a critical groundwater area. So I'm just wondering why that cannot be put in our basin rule somehow without the critical groundwater designation.
So classification does not prevent application, and the Water Resources Commission can approve an application even with classification in place saying we won't allocate water this way. So from the department's perspective, we want to make it very clear that the basin is closed for any further allocation.
Okay, so can you explain to me then what a moratorium is and why some areas have that and they're not a critical groundwater designated area?
So as far as I know, moratorium isn't the term we
Well, it may
use.
not be, I don't know what it is,
There-
like Christmas Valley. I think.
There's classification, there's withdrawal of unallocated water. And then we have what we call groundwater limited areas in the Willamette Valley. But essentially, it's all application of the same principle, which is we are gonna classify for certain uses and quantities only. So as we've talked about in this process, up in the uplands, we're talking about classifying for exempt uses only, meaning we won't authorize any new groundwater permits. We will allow exempt uses, domestic, the specific uses that are called out as exempt in statute, right? Stock water and et cetera.
Right.
And so in those areas, people could still apply for permits. We still have to evaluate them. And then they could go before the Water Resources Commission and ask for them to be approved even
You
above.
have to understand that the value that you're taking from us in declaring our land in this is a lot compared to you not having the rule you need and the stuff written properly. And that, to me, needs to be fixed, legislatively or, through rules, not having an impact on us if you don't need to.
That's absolutely fair. And that's why we classified back in 2016.
Yeah.
And that, for the most part, has prevented new water right applications from being authorized. It does not prevent unused water rights from being further developed or from water rights that are already in permit phase from being certificated or moved forward through that process, right? And to be clear, this doesn't prevent that either.
But that's my point, is you've heard from the community and you've heard from the group, there's some protective control measures we would also like to see. And they don't appear here. The canceling of the water rights, the enforcement of permit conditions.
They're gonna need to fall under this, any one or more provisions that provides for the public welfare, health, and safety.
So it'd be nice to see those spelled out. So I don't have to look up all those ORSs to see if they actually fall in.
So this is just the groundwater act, so it meets the purposes and intent.
Why wouldn't we spell out that we'd like to enforce permit conditions? Why wouldn't we spell out that we'd like to see the department take the action and cancel the paper water rights so we don't have to report on our neighbors?
So, because in this report, we are just talking about the statutory corrective control provisions and calling out which ones we would use. As we move forward, we'll go into that more. But for the purposes of this report, we're calling out exactly what in statute we are going to propose.
But when you talk about sub-area, you talk about getting reasonably stable, you've said enforcing permit conditions in those 9 areas are needed. You've talked about 2018, those you've spelled out as your direction to figure out how to get reasonably stable, but in the groundwater report, you don't put it in that you're gonna use them? Doesn't make sense to me.
It's just a couple of things, Mark. I appreciate your comments. One, see, when we're gonna notify this groundwater report, there is a memo that I did not send to the group because I didn't feel like it was appropriate because I need to notify everyone all at once, but there's a memo that's attached to it that spells out exactly what you're talking about, the different ways you manage groundwater. This particular report is only for the critical groundwater area. And these corrective control measures are only the critical groundwater area corrective control measures that are authorized under ORS 537.735. So those permit decline conditions, yes, we're planning to do that. And I understand not seeing it on the screen can be a little bit frustrating, but we're just kind of focusing on that critical groundwater area statutes right now. And we will be talking about permit decline conditions.
And I think when we look at some of our future topic areas here and get into that, that's a question we're gonna ask, what's missing? What's out of order? And if there's something missing and out of order, we need to insert those in. So we'll go Fred, and then if we can kind of, there's gonna be talk about some of the components of this as we move forward.
I want to go back to Silver Creek, you know, and Weaver Springs a little bit. Just make a point where we have some consistent older data to monitoring in both of those areas. And listening very carefully over the last years, I don't believe that anybody ever said that there's a measurable connection in water level conditions in Silver Creek and Weaver Springs. In other words, Weaver Springs is dropping really fast. That's not translated anywhere in all the meetings I attended to conditions in Silver Creek. That's really a problem of technical proficiency and an administration and a regulation, and because there's a big separation in reality there, but even on a technical level, to me, so when you include these designations like that, then I think it's a real weakness, but has there been a link, major well influence from Silver Creek to Weaver Springs?
I'm not the appropriate person to answer that. We can get back to them.
I don't think so, but anyway, that's sort of the same point on the south part, so. But there's other smaller areas that come into play on that, where you get back to site-specific well conditions are a vital concern that affect value and permits and linkage. And I see language, I see that just closing totally, when I would like to know better over time that this major decline is tied to this smaller decline. You know, are we talking about one aquifer on some of this or not? I'd like to get to a better place. I understand that you guys have piles of information this deep, but what we see on the ground sometimes is real, measurable, and quantifiable. I'll check.
Thanks, Fred. I just wanted to make a comment because I feel tensions are rising a little bit in the room. To point out the fact that, I think it was at another meeting earlier this week, we talked about, this groundwater report. In your future processes of setting up critical groundwater areas, this report will be provided before the process starts. So we here in Harney County and all our collaborative stuff, and this is actually reminding me a lot of place-based planning with the groundwater phase, that we were trying to start doing this process before all the tools are actually in place. And I hope that we can all take a deep breath and realize that we're somewhat trying to do things out of order. And just take a deep breath and relax and realize that we are gonna get a chance to talk about everything. And I hope we can move forward and just, you know, realize that, just calm down and we'll get to all the questions and I'm sure Tim will keep us all on track.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
So I agree, Karen, but I'll ask a process question. So you're gonna get to it probably, this is going out for public comment. Public comment won't end until our RACs end, and then there won't be probably any changes on this report till after that process, correct?
So. Public comment, will continue through the end of the public comment period for this rule process. So the general process for the rules, you go through a RAC, you get to some form of the rules. We then notice those rules for public comment. There's a public comment period. And then at the end of that is when both the public comment for the actual rules and the public comment for this report will end. We will then present a final report of this commission, including an evaluation of the comments and information received to the Water Resources Commission prior to adoption of the rules drafted as part of this Rules Advisory Committee.
So working with this group, consulting with the counties, consulting with the tribes would not cause this report to change until after the full public comment period is done, that we are completely finished. So even if this is a contradiction to what we want to do in the rest of the rules, is there any way that a department would change that before the public comment is done?
I don't know. We're in uncharted territory here.
I know, that's what I'm asking, because if not, we now know our side works for the critical groundwater designation. I mean, if that's what,
I think
the process.
I mean, the scientific data isn't gonna change, right? Like, that's not negotiable. I think from a boundary standpoint, like, we've heard some really good comments here. I don't think that needs to change the report in order to change what we do in the rulemaking, right?
I mean, what you've done is that you're gonna do the Greater Harding Valley Area Concern is a critical groundwater designation, and you've shown that in this report. So if this report doesn't get changed, so after the rules, that's their side work.
So
for the critical groundwater designation.
This is the report for the proposed critical groundwater area. It is not the report of the final critical groundwater area. And so this is to lay the basis and form the problem statement. And then what we actually do in the rules does not have to line up with this specifically, right? Because nowhere in here did I say that the critical groundwater area should be the give back boundary. Did I?
No, but the 15 sub areas is the give back.
Right, I put it in, I put it in,
Is the 15 sub areas the give back, Tim?
yes.
Okay.
And I said from the beginning, I'm putting it in our framework because that's what we've been working with. I'm trying to help
I'm just asking.
answer some of those questions that have come in, like which sub areas have tripped or met threshold for designation. And so that in this presentation, I am giving you more than what is in the actual report, because we don't talk about sub areas in the report. We don't specify what the boundary should be. We identify the groundwater reservoir and which thresholds have been tripped and where, and then which corrective control provisions we're proposing to use to solve the problem. Though what area we do that in is not decided in this report.
Yeah, let me.
So I'm sorry I didn't make that more clear at the start. Yeah.
I was just assuming that it was a presentation.
I think another good thing we can do is knowing that we got time like this, right? We're gonna be looking at a lot of different things over the course of the number of RAC meetings here. You can always be asking yourself, is this gonna limit what you're able to do in these future conversations? And if it is, let's get back. But we can dig into some of these items that are gonna be a little more participatory here.
And then the last thing I had is this report is also used and required to be used in rule to facilitate coordination with local governments and aid with engagement with federally recognized Indian tribes. So, affected local governments as defined, in our rules comes out to City of Pines, Harney County Court.
Okay, so moving forward, let's, if we can just hold it and we'll try to truck forward. Carrie, I really appreciate your comments and you're right. Tensions do get a little high sometimes. I think that's okay. I think, this helps. And this is a really hard conversation. So everybody has some emotion and getting that out, I think is okay. And I think we're building a lot of understanding through these kind of conversations about how all this plays together. So, we do want to keep moving because we do want to spend a lot of time today talking about, how we're going to plan all these future items and where we need to add more discussion so that we can have a lot more influence on, this decisions that are made. So let's do public comment. We have 2 public comments. Okay.
And
So
then
if possible.
we have one online too. Ken Bailey would like to make a public comment.
3 public comments. Really appreciate it if you can keep it to 2 to 3 minutes. Please be respectful of the people in the room and of the department when providing your comment, and go right ahead. I know you were up first.
So I have a couple of questions on this. Will we ever come back to the topic? Like, you say it's kind of open to change a little bit before it does, but like PTW, when you guys presented that, we didn't have really a lot of time to digest it. And we just started moving on, and it took us about 2 months to really figure out what it was. And then when we brought it up in the meeting, it was very disruptive and stuff. So I didn't know if we would have more time to talk about this or visit about this topic. The other thing is, like Christmas Valley, when I talked to, real estate, talked to district manager, water managers, and I asked them if there's a moratorium like we were talking, they understand what that word means and that there's no more water rights. So Christmas Valley, if you guys don't use that term as moratorium, then what do you use? Or what should we, correct language should we be using? Like Christmas Valley, that we don't have, that we can't do anything in there. They can do some inner tradings, but they can't do any more water rights. They don't have any, I'm pretty sure you don't have any more allocation. Why can't we use the same wording there if we're doing terms of critical owner?
So I guess before. Appreciate that, and what, can you state your name? Kirby Blackburn? Okay, thank you. For public comment, we're not, the department or members of RAC aren't always in a position to answer questions, so I think with all those, we can capture them and get back and ideally respond to questions, after the fact, but, or at break, if you want to grab one of them and see if there's some answers, but I think if we answer every public comment question, we could really spend a lot of time that we may not have, so, but it's recorded for the record and we'll make sure we can get back to that. Back there.
So why can a neighbor buy something 15, 20 miles away that has dried up wells and transfer those water rights into our backyard where we've been pumping for 20, 30 years? And all of a sudden we have the junior water right because the water right they bought at the original place 15 miles away has an older right than us. And so we have the junior, even though they are just putting their pivots in this year, which is 7 of them. And we've been pumping for years and years. And now we're in the Donner Blitz area. So we haven't met that threshold, but the way I understood it, or Ivan, we are the junior water right now because the state allowed them to transfer that.
And what's your name?
Jake Davis.
Thank you, Jake. Again, great questions. I think what we can do is get those answers for you.
That same question's been asked 6 or 7 times.
Okay.
So,
Every rack, the last four racks, that question.
yeah, I don't think it's fair, and why are they, if we're in this criteria right now, why are they allowed to drill a well right now and continue to put this in? I mean, when are we gonna protect that area? When we're in this problem with Beaver Springs and Buchanan, and then we'll address it.
I had the same problem, but it was the state doing it.
Okay. Again, I don't want to imply that I'm dismissing any comments, but it's, it's difficult to answer a lot of questions on the fly that maybe we're not prepared. So, and if this is something that keeps coming up and you're not getting answers, we'll work with the department to make sure we get some response to that. Maybe we can pull that into the presentation. Okay, we have one online. If you can state your name first.
For the record, Ken Beerley, couple of things. It became clear to me at the end when it was identified that in fact the groundwater report that for the critical groundwater area is simply a background report. It is not determinative of either the area designation or the activities that would be curtailed. So that's that helps me to allay the concerns. The second thing is more of a suggestion on process. It would be helpful if in future RACs you consider looking at alternative configurations of boundary designations, and then alternative control measures as well, so that people will have an idea of what those alternatives are, how they would be affected, what those effects might be, and perhaps use some common alternatives, model the common alternatives to see how effective they might be. Because right now it appears that the focus is going to be on acute areas, and treating acute areas may not have much of an effect on other parts of the basin. So trying to figure out what's obvious to me from the groundwater model is that the areas to the north are going to recharge much more rapidly than, say, Weaver Springs, which will take, well, hell, I'll be dead, a long time to recover if at all. Anyway, I think it would be very helpful to structure the conversation so people would have an idea of what the alternatives are, so that they can look at those and look at the consequences of those alternatives, both for boundary designation as well as control measures within the boundary designations. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And we have one more public comment period of time we'll do at the end. So if you're listening in online or you're here and you didn't get a chance, we'll do that as well. I also want to, we had a few RAC members join that didn't get a chance to introduce themselves in the beginning. Just want to go ahead. Oh, Jess Winning, your refuge. So Jess is joining us now. We haven't had, an active, we at the refuge. Currently for the RAC. So Jess is going to be joining in the future. Fred, I don't think you.
From Diamond.
Anybody else we missed?
Yeah, we've got two online. We've got Ben McKenna and Brandon Haslick.
Great, thank you. If you guys want to introduce yourselves or just accept Kelly's introduction.
Yeah, Brandon Haslick, Burns Pike Tribe.
Ben, go ahead.
Let's keep on moving. Go to the next slide. Okay, so what we want to talk about right now is RAC decision points. So the key questions here, is there anything missing from the scope of the rulemaking going forward? Meaning the scope being sort of the table you're going to see here soon. And is the sequence of the topics, anything changes we can make to make it a smoother timeline. So the focus of this conversation, and this is at the involved level, because we really want to know from you, does this work? So let's go to the next slide and just cut through it. And we can let this sit here. Everybody can see that. Okay. Yeah, you got a copy.
No, it's different.
Oh, it's different. Yeah, actually, you're right.
Yeah. So we went ahead and made. Go ahead, Brian. Sorry.
Email to us. Sorry, Kelly.
Go ahead, Kelly.
Oh, no, it's okay. So yeah, so this is going to look different from what you have in front of you, because we received comments that this decision tree, or milestones, is what I like to call it, was missing several topics, which was correct, right? It was missing the critical ground area boundary and sub-area delineation and prioritization of the sub-areas. That wasn't in here, and that, I think, implied that we didn't want to talk about it. And so I went ahead and updated this last night. And so we kind of made those changes. Brian, did you want to lead this conversation? No, I can do it. It's up to you.
How about I lead it, you jump in when you can, but so basically what you're saying is just what you added for RAC A is what's added. the top row. Is that accurate?
Yes, and and also the critical here, I can annotate here, the critical groundwater area boundary sub-area delineation. And then the prioritization of sub areas was not in this these charts.
So Mark, what I heard is it'd be good to take this home and have some time with it.
I mean, we can shoot from the hip here, but I mean, it's one, it's hard for, you to read it, and two. I mean, I got some comments, but yeah, let's move forward to comments, but let's at least make sure that we have some time. I mean, even if we can get somebody to print it, we can come back to it after break would be great. I mean.
You got your pilot's license and you can't read that from here?
I mean, I can, but I mean, I can start telling the right stuff.
Yeah, that's, I mean, what we want to know, I mean, just stick in the process, not digging into these. What's missing, where's
So
that?
what's missing is what we just talked about, was one, we haven't said the department's gonna move forward with the areas of critical groundwater designation, or we're gonna have continued conversation on it. That would have to occur, in my mind, before sub areas. And even before prioritization of sub areas, which happens in RAC 9, we should have a discussion on sub areas. And I've talked about sub areas when we were talking to Steve Greenwich at USGS, he talked about we should be using the model for sub areas and PTW. So we should doing the model conversation before we can do the sub area conversation, before we can do the prioritization of sub areas, before we can do PTW.
All right, I'm typing as fast as
I can write these up, but I mean,
So-
there's a lot missing for RAC number.
Okay, that's good. I mean, that's exactly
Second that motion.
Kelly, go ahead.
Can I chime in here? Okay, like let me tell you my thought process here. So maybe you guys can maybe think about it if we take a break. So my thought process is, and can you see my annotation if I draw here? 1 second.
Kelly, there's an echo. I don't know if you got. So I'm blind and hard of hearing, but there is an echo.
Yeah, it's a good echo when you're talking about it.
Okay, hold on 1 sec.
There's a number of us handicapped.
Thanks, Fred. Appreciate your company.
Do I sound, am I better?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, thank you. Okay, if I could just walk through maybe my thought process through this, and I'm really interested in your guys' input. So talking about the USGS model and the groundwater model, looking at rack number 9, 10, and 11 here. So you see there's this very large square box. And how I'm approaching all these topics is through a 3-step process. So on rack number 9, we start, we start talking about model management scenarios, but we begin with what's the goal of the groundwater, right? Stabilizing, are we going to try to do some manage declines as we stabilize? Do we want to recover? What is the area of the boundary of that critical groundwater area that we want to input into this model? And then how do we want to carve up this model, right? And we're going to run several different model runs. And so we're going to be talking, like basically doing step-by-step conversations. And so rack number 9 is just the beginning of that conversation. You're probably going to need some information from us. We're going to provide that information for you. And then we're going to start talking about, okay, what are the different model scenarios that we want to run with this, with the USGS model. And then in rack number 10, after providing information, after you guys sit through it, then we can come back and start actually putting on paper what those management scenarios we want to see being ran. And then rack number 11 here, the very last square on 1113 here, that's when we have the model management runs and we talk through which one we think is appropriate. And from there, we'll select that model management run. And in rack 12 and 13, we actually start writing rule language. And so this theme of having 3 different conversations is what I'm trying to do with everything, right? So today we're talking about swamp on classification, specifically the boundaries. Then on rack number 10, we're going to talk about specifically what happens within the SWAMPA and within the classification, right? So talking about limited license, John, and transfers, stuff like that within classification boundaries. And then we'll talk about that. Then we'll incorporate those conversations and talk more when we talk about rule language. So I'm trying to set up the scope where we can have 3 times conversations through all of these different topics. And really what I want to get out from you guys, if you could think about it, and if we don't, I know I'm throwing this out in front of you today, right? And I'll send you guys tomorrow this document. It's not going to look pretty, but I'll send it to you guys and you can go ahead and just send me your comments. Email me and say, hey, I think this should be moved here. I should think this should be moved there. And I'll incorporate that. Now, don't be alarmed. I'm going on vacation starting tomorrow afternoon for 2 weeks. So if you get a reply email back from me, it's not because I'm not listening. It's just I'm not around my computer. Sorry. But yeah, that's my thought process. That's why this is set up the way it is. And I just want to know if I'm missing something from the scope, or if a particular topic should be moved up or moved back, or do we need to spend more time on a particular topic? And that's what I'm trying to get out in this conversation.
I mean,
Make sense? Go ahead.
I just wonder, is there an opportunity to do some online stuff in between?
Yes, there's gonna be opportunity to do stuff in between, yes, and we're gonna talk about that in a little
We
bit.
don't seem to get as far as we like, and I think we're gonna have to step up the conversations.
Yeah, a little preview.
Well,
After break, we are going to dig into which of these require deeper dives and what do you need to know to dive deeper? And then we'll talk about how those will frame up. So yes. And maybe this is a clunky way to do this. We're just trying to get the order straight and then figure out which ones we dig deeper into later.
And I'll just put out there, there's, a Google at 17, more people can join us Monday morning. We can go through this and get official comments or not official. We can get comments back.
Yeah, let's put a pin in that. That'll play into the conversation we're gonna have a little bit later. Lisa?
I've got a couple of different comments. First one is the title of this document has been changed to RAC decision points. And I think as we talked about last time, we're not a deciding body. And so I think we should be careful on the language to make sure we're conforming to requirements of a RAC and not sort of usurping functions that belong to the agency.
I agree. I don't think decision points is a good title.
That's a bad title.
Yep,
It
right.
puts you on the wrong part of this chart.
Yep, you're absolutely right.
So I would ask that be corrected, and that changed since it was sent out. And that's another comment I have, which is, I do get, it's a little disorienting to review the documents ahead of time. And then hear that people had comments after they were sent out, and so the document was changed before we got to the meeting. So I guess I would ask that, I know sometimes that has to happen, but I would just try and keep that to a minimum. So
Yeah,
that we
let me
can-
clarify that. It
Yeah.
was internal comments. And you're right. And I guess this kind of goes to one of the points made earlier, is there's a lot of work happening here and the department's trying to get this stuff out as soon as they can, but then, we're always a little bit behind the 8 ball and we're looking at, honestly, it's partly to me. And it's Oregon consensus. We're looking at this saying, man, we need, we're missing this, we're missing that. And that's where some of the changes come. It's more from us, from a process standpoint, trying to get this right before the meeting. And sometimes we're doing that at the 11th hour.
Okay,
But it's not comments from the RAC.
okay, and I appreciate that,
Yeah.
I understand that. And then my third is way more in the weeds, but maybe relates back to some of the comments that Ken barely just made, but maybe that model management scenario selection and discussion should be moved up in the schedule, because that seems like something that could help really inform some of the other discussions. And I know that's a big lift, time-wise too. So I know there's like a reality kind of feasibility piece to that, but,
So we are gonna, we're gonna actually ask, in some sense, it should be on today, because we are gonna ask some questions about that later today. And we got it on the very next meeting, so I wouldn't look at this as an order like up,
okay,
down is
Okay.
everything is in rack number 9.
okay. that helps.
How many days is that, right?
Yeah.
no,
Well, that's what we're gonna talk about later, is the discuss, we gotta dig deeper into these, because we don't have the time to do this in meetings, so there's gonna be other levels.
So I have a question. Has the department already decided what they want to do? And is the RAC here just to listen, or does our input make a difference?
Your input absolutely makes a difference.
a lot of these items coming up, Andy, are gonna be different than what we've done so far.
Mhm.
And there's gonna be a
And-
lot more
And
discussion.
how do we make a difference, Tim? In the decision process?
But providing feedback about it. And as we get into the next RAC specifically, we are gonna be talking about boundaries. We're gonna be talking about, should we leave out the building? Should Silver Creek be different than others, right? We're gonna talk about that, and then we're gonna put that into a management scenario, which we can test with the model. And then we can use the outcomes of that model to inform our decision-making going forward. But you're gonna help, as RAC members, help us build alternatives outside of the proposal that we have already produced for you. We plan to test that because we want to see where we were. And it's the most ready to test. But we want to talk through alternatives, and we want you to help us build those alternatives. And then we need to see what the outcomes are. And I think from my perspective on this next RAC, what's really important is we need to talk through the goal, how we evaluate success, as has been mentioned by many RAC members over time. And then I don't think we talk about the model first, because the model is a tool by which we can evaluate our thoughts, right? So we have to come up with a hypothesis of this is the right way to manage the basin, and we're gonna do this. And then we test that with the model and we see what the outcome is, and did it match our success criteria? And are our outcomes what we wanted? And if they're not, then we need to go back to the drawing board and say, what did we, like, now that we have this piece of information about how the system works, based on what we did to it, let's try something else and see what that looks like. And that's the goal of trying to do this over multiple RAC meetings. I think where the challenge is going to be is in my team being able to provide the actual model runs and the information back in a way that we can digest it relatively quickly and simply to make iterative decisions. And that's like, that is what scares me. And I'll be very frank, that is what scares me in this process. I don't know that we can turn it around that fast. We're gonna do our darndest, but that is a concern for sure.
And we're going to talk about that after break, digging deeper into how we can spend more time on these and get your input.
So Tim, I'll just say, I mean, you got TNC willing to do some models too. There's a group of us that have hired a hydrologist, you saw him online here, would like to collaborate with TNC in the department to add to that, so it's not anybody doing it in a vacuum. There's more resources to help us get through more of those scenarios than just 3, because I agree with you. It's gonna be an iterative process, so we can build upon what we learned and what we learned and what we learned to refine. We can't throw 6 of them out there and then pick the best one, we won't get the best results. We gotta run an iterative process.
Yeah. Okay.
We have Dominic Carrillo has a hand up.
Oh, okay, go right ahead.
All right, thanks. So, yeah, thanks, Dominic Crowell for Harney County. And I apologize, I haven't been as closely involved in the prior RAC meeting. So if this is kind of rehashing old stuff, I apologize. But and if this is the wrong time to make this comment or ask these questions, let me know. But well, if we're talking about this decision points thing, one of the things I noticed in the materials for the meeting is that there was a document that had stuff where RAC input would be likely allowed, and then other places were maybe unnecessary. And one of those was the permissible total withdrawal, where the department said they would not be seeking input from the RAC on the total permissible withdrawal. I have a question or two about that, but I guess first of all, I just wondered if the department could expand on that a little bit.
Is that, I'll ask the question to the department, are we getting into that a little bit later, or is this a good time?
So what we're talking about there, Dominic, thank you for the question, is in our current proposed management scenario, and just remember that we're running different management scenarios. We used 2 different methods to determine the PTW. One, the aforementioned HydroRAF approach that was mentioned this morning for our 6 high priority sub areas. And then for the other 9 lower priority sub areas, we just set the 2018 PTW. So we do not expect any further input on that particular calculation, because we feel like it's the best available science. Pause though, I know that we need to test those PTWs in our groundwater in the USGS model. So we're gonna actually determine, and we might change PTW based off of the model and not the hydrograph approach. So that's what we're trying to say there. And then Tim, I don't know if you want to add anything there.
I think that's accurate. Like for the PTW calculations that already exist, we filed it, we followed a scientific approach. We made that public. We explained how we did it. We want to test that. We're not looking for input on what those numbers are, but we are looking for input on what that outcome is. And then we want to compare that to alternatives that we build as part of this process with the RAC.
Okay, well, just one comment on that, and you can choose to respond or not. And I do have one or two other questions related to this, but I mean, one comment on that is that, I mean, I can't speak for the other RAC members, but I know like Harney County, you know, they have engaged an outside consultant, for instance, to look at the 2022 USGS report. And I mean, I think Harney County's position is that the department ought to be open to peer review of those types of calculations, especially since they're so critical. I think it's a little anti-scientific to not be open to third-party input on that, particularly RAC members that might have their own scientific consultants or experts that could provide that peer review. The other question I had though on that is that, so I want to make sure I understand, and it might be helpful possibly to other RAC members. So for the PTW, is it the department's intent that that PTW is going to apply for the entire critical groundwater area, and that PTW would not be split up among the different sub areas?
So we're starting to get in the weeds there. I would say that that is a topic for future conversation. However, previously, what we have said is we intend to set PTWs by sub area and then allocate that PTW to individual rights within that sub area. And that the critical groundwater area as a whole would have a PTW that is the summation of all PTWs in each sub area, right? So you take all the sub areas, add them up, and that's the critical area sub area. It's PTW.
Okay, so setting aside whether or not the department has statutory authority to divide the PTW among sub areas, I'm wondering, is the RAC going to have input on how that allocation of PTW among sub areas would be determined?
Yep, that's on the chart that was shared here, allocation of the permissible total.
Okay, because when I read that, it was talking about priority. I didn't see where it's talking about splitting up sub areas, but maybe I'm not looking at it right now, so I maybe just misremembered it. But I'm just wondering, like, is there a model or scientific method that the department will be using to allocate that PTW among sub areas?
So I think we're gonna get into this.
Yeah, but just Dominic, just real quick, I think.
Well, I think that issue is critical. The reason why is, I mean, for instance, in Northeastern Oregon, you guys have a bunch of small critical groundwater areas like Butter Creek and Stage Gulch that are very in close proximity that have their own separate permissible withdrawals. You guys are talking about doing one huge area that would include sub areas. You guys made different PTW determinations for each of those critical groundwater areas. I'm trying to understand how that's going to work scientifically here. And I think probably other RAC members can chime in, but I think they might be interested to know how the department intends to do that.
Right, so each sub area, and what we have proposed, this is still being worked on, is that each sub area would have a PTW that gets allocated to rights within that sub area. And allocation then happens based on prior appropriation, so priority date of the water right, as well as we would like to, if at all possible, base it on historic beneficial use. So if a senior right has not been using their full paper water right, we would allocate them what they have been using and then reserve the rest of the PTW for another more junior user.
Okay, I just want to take a quick time out here. So what I want to prevent is digging into each one of these because we really want to focus on steps and process. So appreciate the question, and I'm not trying to dismiss it as unimportant, but we're gonna lose the opportunity to determine if this is something that we need to dig into deeper And as well as these other topics, if we start down the path on each one of these.
Yeah, I think we scratched the surface plenty adequately. I just think it informs how people might think some of these other things should be prioritized and ordered. Thanks.
Understood, thank you.
And also, I understand that, Brian, but, one thing we're still struggling with, at least a lot of us around this table, is if we don't get the questions answered here in conversation, we submit them, and they might be months out. And we haven't been told we'll have conversations on those, we get a written document. So some of these questions that we're asking and they're asking, we're gonna have to figure out how to get them answered prior to diving into these, or while we're diving into these. I understand why you don't want to hear.
You're absolutely right. And I think that's why we've decided we gotta add more process to this. Because we just can't do it. We're behind eight ball all the time. So you're right, you're all right. So we'll talk about it, promise. Kelly proposed that you take this, sit with it, get back to us. Good with that? Okay.
He's gonna send it.
Yeah, you'll get it in an email, right, Kelly? And they can email you back. We need to set up RAC 9, yeah, but we can keep playing with the future.
So Kelly, you're gonna make it cowboy friendly, aren't you?
Yeah, I'll work with Brenda and then see if she can maybe get you the document, Fred. If somebody,
Fred, is that the Pony Express tonight?
Okay.
yeah, I don't know, I'll work with somebody, Fred, but I'll get you it, yeah.
Let's take our break.
Valley deliberately regulates.
Before we go to break, 10 minutes, all right? Because we do have a lot to talk about and we don't want to lose that time. So it's 10:53. So why don't we say 7 minutes? Please try to be back at 3 o'clock. Don't go too far. When you hear me saying, hey, everybody, time to sit down, don't ignore me. Actually come back and sit down. I know you all do it. That's right, yeah, 3 o'clock. take our seats. Okay, what we're gonna get into now are, I guess the one box on that chart we just looked at that was checked for today. And that is, classification and the swamp boundary. So we wanna kind of talk through these, design, make clear what the sideboards are that the department has to work within on each one of these, and then, discuss where there might be some opportunity to make changes that are reflective of your interests. So, building a shared understanding about both of these boundaries, so we all fully understand what they are, is our goal for today. We want to know, we'll answer, what options that have been offered by the RAC, how those are being responded to, what options are being considered by the department and why, what are the levels of RAC agreement and disagreement with those options. So this is an involved level thing. There is some room here to make these reflective of the RAC's interest, but we do want to try to, at least in, maybe one more than the other, but we do want to come away from this with a mutual understanding of what these boundaries are and where they are. Make sense? This is gonna help us in a lot of future discussions to have this established. Okay, Tim.
All right, so hopefully everybody grabbed one of these in the back, when you came in, it's a map packet. We'll try to make maps easier for everybody to understand. So it's one boundary per map. So if you can pull apart to have laid maps next to each other to compare, that might be helpful. But we're gonna talk about classification. So just to orient really quick. On the first map, we have the Malheur Lake Administrative Basin. That is important because that is what these rules can affect. So we cannot do anything in this rulemaking that goes outside of that green boundary. That's it. That's all we got. As far as we can go. The department does not have the power to go any further.
Okay, pause. Everybody good with that? Understand that? Why that is? Mark.
In this rulemaking, why couldn't you go into the river basin?
The Malheur Basin?
River basin,
Yeah, we could. It would require opening the rules for the Malheur River Basin and engaging the stakeholders from that location. And the department has chosen not to do that at the same time.
So, even the department's decision is why you can't.
Correct, but even with, this process, this rules advisory committee falls within this green boundary. So you wouldn't get to, like, Mark, you wouldn't be on the RAC for the Malheur Basin, river basin. I mean, it's possible you could be on the RAC, but likely we would pick a different RAC, right? It's the Malheur River Basin instead of Malheur Lake Administrative Basin. The next boundary is the groundwater study area, so that's in red here. This is where the groundwater study occurred, right? So this is the boundaries within which that 2022 groundwater report that was released focuses. So that is for reference, so that we can all understand where we have a peer-reviewed scientific report. And that's that Harney Basin map. So then the next map says draft on it, and that is the proposed classification boundary, and that's in like a orangey color, tan, I don't know, that color. And as you can see, some key differences between that map and the previous two is that we clipped the area of Crook County and the area of Lake County that falls within the Harney Basin study area, and we left those out. So we're basically following the Malheur Lake Administrative Basin boundary at most times, and the Harney groundwater study area boundary at most times. But when we reach two counties, Lake and Crook, we crop those out. And so that's the proposal there.
So we want to stop there, right?
Yep.
Okay.
And I want to note, there are no groundwater points of diversion or points of appropriation, I should really say, that exist within the excluded parts of Lake and Crook counties. So currently, there has been no groundwater development in Crook or Lake counties that falls inside the Malheur Lake Administrative Basin. We do not anticipate be based on the land ownership and based on the topography.
Would it be possible to share the maps on the screen for the people online? Because right now it's like a podcast, which, you know, your voice is a good podcast voice, but I think we want to see the map.
It's nice of you to say, Kelly. Give me a second and I will see if I can pull up the map.
So while he's doing that, in the room, questions about the lines, why they are where they are. Right.
Yeah, there's a big difference that you don't mention there, and that difference we've talked about a little bit at previous meetings is on the east side. Down Virginia Valley, down
Right.
below New Princeton, and that's a substantial, just so people track it, substantial difference there.
So the difference Fred's calling out here is this area right here.
Yeah.
This area of Virginia Valley, as you can see in the Malheur Lake, administrative basin boundary is not included. But it was included in the groundwater study area. And it is not included in the proposed classification area because it falls outside the Malheur Lake administrative boundary. So that's the other, very good call out, Fred, I appreciate that. That's the other key change, so small portion of Crook, small portion of Lake, and then Virginia Valley, a small, which is a relatively small portion of land that was clipped out because the Malheur Lake administrative basin doesn't go that far.
And that is based on some of the department mentioned. That was what they perceived as the bathtub drain. In reality, there's one, you know, 1 point at Crane and 1 point north of Whitty Point, et cetera. When you look at the surface geology, anyway, that's part of the area that the department determined that's where the Donna Brook stands up, that water.
There is some groundwater flow there, and then that's where it leaves if there is, when water leaves the basin, that's where it leaves through.
That would be where surface water, that's where it would have years, eons ago. But it changes, you know. My point is that's a big change. And there's actually, in my view, 3 flows that come together right there. And so where that boundary is a big deal, even though it's a small area. That's my only point.
So so is that your recommendation then that we need to classify that? We need to open them out here, river rules and classify that area?
I think that's a good, maybe just stay there, Tim, like to help, and maybe I just don't always understand it, but explain the sideboards that you're under when it comes to changing these lines. Like what has to happen if you were to say that it's older?
So the green area, as I've said, is the area in which we can, like, the rules we're talking about actually apply. Virginia Valley, put in there, falls outside. And what Fred is talking about is that is a place in which the Harney Basin groundwater reservoir extends to. And the report noted there was some groundwater flow leaving the basin through that location. And so groundwater flows essentially not from the lake, because the lake, as Fred has talked about, is mostly disconnected from the groundwater flow system. But groundwater flows out and into the Malheur River Basin through that corridor, where, as Fred said, eons ago, surface water actually discharged through there until it was blocked by lava flows. So that is the area of concern that Fred's talking about. For these rules, we can't classify that area, but I hear am I hearing that you want to classify that area? You think it should be classified?
No, I'm just saying that's an example of an area where there's lots going on.
Okay.
When you talk to individual irrigators there, and the history over the last 20 or so years, there's subsurface, there's a lot going on there, and that's an example of a lot of diversity. And really, in lots of people's view, there's disagreement on how that functions relative to, I think we definitely know, we don't know the department believes there's water coming from the west there on what we call Black Butte. And anyway, that's an example of a boundary change. I'm not saying it needs to be changed. I'm just pointing out that it is an example of more complex hydrogeological condition than most people believe.
Yeah, that's one question.
Good to know. Hold on, Mark.
Because it was in the groundwater study area. The PTW, the paper water rights, the wind water rights that have been used in the analysis of the administrative areas, are they included?
In Virginia Valley?
Yeah. My understanding is they are.
I don't know off the top of my head, so I have
So
to,
it changes the map. If they were, and if we're going to exclude, we need to change the map.
okay, that's fair, yeah, absolutely.
I'll just say the info that the water right in that area being excluded was recently moved from area that is part of the,
Yeah. Okay, and there's still more down there though, is that right?
Okay, that created a cone depression there, could that draw more from us? Because the way you guys talk about cone depressions, it brings it from everywhere else. So why wouldn't you include it as part of our potential problem if you didn't, could they develop more there? Or would you do a moratorium?
So if we do not classify there, it is still available for allocation. We believe our allocation of, the update we're doing to our allocation rules is likely going to prevent further development there without the need to classify. But it is not for certain. So what I'm hearing is it sounds like there's a lot of concern around this area. Is that fair?
The group was at a meeting monthly, 16 or 17, sent a memo to you asking for it to be included. Knowing that it might not be logistically possible to do at this time, but we would like to see it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's good feedback.
So what, I guess.
So that's a great piece of feedback. The other piece of the boundary I want to make sure I get good feedback on is the Crook and Lake counties. Where we've flipped at the border. So you pull up your map, you can see where the line goes from being jagged to straight at the county line. That's a place that was flipped in both Crook and then down in Lake counties. How's the RAC feel about that?
Same reason, you have to include people from Cook and Lake County, that way you did not include it, or what's the reason why you did it?
Our decision-making process was, before we can consider an area for classification, we have to do a certain amount of outreach to legislators, members of counties, like county courts, et cetera. And we did not believe that the additional overhead in time and resource there was worth the effort for including those small areas that do not have groundwater points of diversion and don't have likely possibility for future development based on land ownership and topography.
You can check the box on the legislator.
I believe you're not Crook.
Oh, that might be that 10 acres I don't have.
Yeah.
He's been trying to get it.
Yeah.
Good job, Tim. Good one.
Yeah.
So what, Tim, is, if you were to add Virginia Valley, and what is it, if you wanna take that back with you to deal with, or do you wanna talk about how that, what would need to happen?
So to talk about Virginia, to add in the slices of Crook and Lake would require the department to do some substantial outreach before we could consider it. But we can do that, and we could expand that boundary out all the way to the edge of the Horny Basin in those areas that were clipped. And I think we could do that.
For me, it depends on whether or not you, are gonna classify the entire area as the swamp, because if you are, your explanation was that people can still develop in those areas, and the designation would allow you to easily, but in these two counties, because it's convenient, you're saying, we don't think people will. And then there's a disconnect there between what I'd like to see, which is which is a administrative area swamp designation for those that meet the criteria. And then, on one hand, you're saying, well, we don't want to do that because I think I'm being clear. Am I being clear enough?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep, I understand that. So I don't want to jump too far into the swamp boundary, but we have not said, our proposal was not to make the swamp boundary the same as classification. It was to make it the same as the give gap, which is what we had proposed for the critical groundwater area. So that's a much smaller area and doesn't include any of these areas out in Crook or Lake.
And what we're interested in, or what I'm interested in, is having the swamp be by the 15 county, by the 15 administrative areas.
Right.
But your explanation for not doing that was, well, then people can still apply and possibly even, but they can also still apply and possibly even get okay here over here.
Sure.
So if that is your criteria for not including them, it should be your criteria, then that should avoid your criteria for
Sure.
why you wouldn't divide the swamp into 15.
So you want consistent logic throughout.
Well, I'm just
I
saying there's
understand.
no logic and I don't really care, but
Okay,
I'm just telling you that it doesn't appear, it does, it fits one but not the other, and
sure.
I'd like to see it.
Yeah.
And to follow up on that, the memo you got from the 16 or 17 or 17 meeting would like you to consider including those other parts of the counties, just to keep you consistent with what the study area was, what the recharges did.
Okay, so the feedback I'm hearing, and does anybody else have any additional, but what I'm hearing is we should add the portions of Crook and Lake and do the outreach necessary to make that boundary line up as best as possible with the Harney Basin study area. As long as it's within the Mount Lake Administrative Basin.
We don't care about that either.
John?
We don't really care.
Any other feedback on that?
Does anybody have any concerns with that, if that was a direction? Why that shouldn't be done? Yes.
I guess, how will this set us way back in our process?
I don't think so. I think we can get it done simultaneously.
I mean, I'm not arguing with Mark, other than that looks like mostly Forest Service and
I believe it came back as Forest Service and BLM.
A huge chunk of it's the national refuge.
no, not what they're cutting out.
To be fair, I don't care.
These that are cutting out,
I just,
right.
I just want the same thought process to
Right.
apply to that history.
Yeah, we're talking about it this time. And there's this boundary right there.
It doesn't make sense to put this.
Yeah, we're not proposing it. Okay, sounds like we're good on that. We'll go back and take that feedback under advisement and move forward, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, it's something I think that we have to consider that, you know, it isn't really, we're mentioning in the area that it's likely to develop groundwater as a force of
Yeah,
it.
that's all. Somebody that developed that.
You know, so it is it's a lift, but if that's what the RAC wants us to take back, then we certainly.
But I also think it's equally the same as that you would put water development in areas where I'm living too, because you'd be a complete fool to do that. And so I can make the case that ain't gonna happen either. And You say it's not gonna happen for,
Well, I'm not saying it's not gonna
no,
happen.
I know, if you're willing to accept the idea that it won't happen, or it may not, probably won't happen because of topography and land ownership. Well, I don't think anybody that's, not, not fried their brain on something, would propose developing any of these other areas either.
And the state, that's good.
Except for the state, yeah.
Is that address Virginia Valley?
It doesn't address Virginia Valley. We would have to talk about opening up the Malheur River Basin rules, and I can't make a comment on that right now. That's above my pay grade by far.
I think we need to leave those 2 areas out and move on. We got other things to.
Yeah,
That's true.
Does anybody have any issue with that?
All right. It's kind of a 180, but all right, I'm okay with it.
Sorry, guys.
I mean, it's true.
It's less work for me, so I appreciate it.
It saved me 2 weeks of work.
Thanks, guys. All right, so the next map was the give gag, that's in blue. This is the currently classified area, right? It's what we, well, the rulemaking that was done back in 2016. So now we're gonna use that as a reference for the next page, which is the swamp boundary in red. And you'll notice that those two boundaries look identical, and that is because what we had proposed was the swamp boundary being identical to the give gag.
So to give you, just so everybody knows. We're back to pizza.
Alexandria, probably ask him to not use acronyms.
Great.
Of the public as well, can you at least one time say the acronym out loud for SWAMPA?
And give gag.
Oh, sorry. Acronym soup today. SWAMPA is a serious water management problem area. And that's an area in which, through rule, the department can require measurement and reporting of water use. So think totalizing flow meter on a well, and then an annual report to the department, of what the total volume pumped, over that time period.
Why don't you change the name to reflect what it actually is, then? You know, swamp a serious water management area as soon as my buyer shows up and he says, well, you're in a serious water management area. Why do you say, yeah, well, we're in an area where they can measure stuff?
That was the unfortunate term we were gifted by the legislature.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's burning. It costs me like $1,500 an acre.
Yeah, without pointing fingers.
We'll take it to 2025 and change it to the opportunity water management.
We still have water management area.
So the reason we proposed the give gag as and the give gag is the Greater Harney Valley groundwater area of concern. It is essentially the polygon that we drew on a map to capture the vast majority of pumping inside the Harney Basin. And did some research. There are currently only 4 groundwater rights outside of that boundary that don't already have a measurement and reporting requirement. So, this boundary captures all but 4 groundwater rights in the Harney Basin study area that don't have measurement and reporting requirements. So that's there's only 4 that would fall outside that. So I've heard, and we talked about this last time, there was a proposal to make the classification boundary and the swamp boundary the same for simplicity's sake, and to capture all water use within the basin. And so changing that boundary and expanding it adds 4 water rights that would then have to add totalizing flow meters to their points of appropriation or their wells. And so that's really, from my perspective, that's the question is, do we keep it at the give gag or do we expand it to the broader classification area?
Where are those?
I believe they are all in the Seneca area. I believe there are 2 former like industrial rights that are from the 30s. And then there's one agricultural right. It's about 80 acres if I remember right. And then I think there's one, I want to say it's 4 acre right. But there's two other municipal rights, but they have a requirement to measure and report anyway already.
Didn't we just, wasn't it discussed last time to, Sylvia Valley, that it's a better chance to include?
Yes. And that's what I'm saying, is that the conversation here is, do we make it a give gag, or do we expand the size of the classification boundary?
Thoughts?
Those four people should be fine, do the classification boundary.
Do we know who those four people are?
We don't, and we don't want to the classification boundary, we lose. We lose all the upland recharge area.
Sure, adding water measurement and reporting in the uplands gives us a true comprehensive water use measurement and reporting rule.
Everybody else is measuring and reporting already. It's just those four that are.
Yeah, and it would then capture those.
And one of those is like.
Yeah, but if it's not. You could potentially. And.
So the classification is going to prevent additional rights from being added. And so all this is doing is retroactively saying to these four groundwater rights, you have to install flow meters and report use on an annual basis.
Could get an exception to the classification and get a new water,
Correct.
rights, you were saying.
you-
New
yeah.
water rights
Yeah.
would be required to measure and report. You don't need
So
a
what's
small.
the? Okay, so I guess I don't have.
So really it comes down to those four rights. Fred?
Yeah, so, I've asked this before, so the Swanland, the
Yep.
Serious Water Management Area. Is it laid out in statute
Yep.
that it only applies to water measurement requirements, or is there other stuff in there? In other words, if you made a decision, that's the part of SWAPA that you're looking at, or the SWAPA, there's other stuff?
Well, only gives us the authority to require measurement and reporting.
That's all.
It does nothing else
On a yearly basis.
on an annual, and it's very clear about annual basis.
And it's actually a rule, not statute.
The annual?
No, the definition is wrong.
No, next time.
And we can't do the measurements ourselves.
Yes, you can.
You can.
The measurement has to be done by a measuring device, totalizing flow meter.
That seems cool.
It's what we do for you already, right?
And then you report it annually, either via our water use reporting, like online tool, or via a paper form.
So
But
I can
You
actually,
can go read your flow meter and submit the data.
but then you're not looking for the well depth, because I have a.
This is only water use.
Oh.
So what you're pumping out.
Yeah, you're doing.
You can't use the power bill? I mean, I don't
Correct.
use it, but a lot of people have asked that question.
Correct.
You cannot?
You cannot. Well, I mean, we'll get there as we talk through the serious water management problem area. Like what we're gonna require within this boundary. But the intent is to capture water use. And report it. So with a meter, generally with a meter, flow meter.
So, just for the audience's sake, I know the answer, not usually, but I do this time. The swap applies to both surface and groundwater, but you're limiting it to groundwater.
We will get there, but yes, our intention is to focus on groundwater. Surface water measurement is not needed at this time.
So question to the RAC, any concerns or question about adding these four additional water rights? That's the question I wanted to answer, and we'll go.
I don't have concerns, but I'm okay if we don't add them. It's just four, and if it's only 80 acres and 4 acres, it's not huge. I mean, we could watch it another way if we needed to. We could always do ETY, give them added expense for 84 acres. That's my opinion, but I'm okay either way.
Okay, let me hear maybe a counter. to that.
Agree.
I agree.
I just think consistency is awesome.
I have a good, yeah, it's a recharge area, I'd like to see measuring and monitoring it.
It's UZT, then they don't have an expense.
But we might be able to figure that in the rules, and it doesn't have to be hard meter, maybe there's different alternative places.
Exactly.
So you're okay with that, Mark?
I know, I just would rather the classification area, but I mean, I'm not gonna, that was sort of.
How much work here? Maybe that's a question.
That's a question for Jason. How much more work is it to have 4 additional rights that we have to potentially regulate or, sorry, law?
This case, 4 rights is not gonna be an issue at all. And really, if we wanted to, we could go out today and require measurement on those wells. If we felt like it was necessary.
Can you say you don't need to designate it as?
No, I'm saying that. Not making that decision, but right now, today, those 4 groundwater rights are.
When they say, you can measure, you can force measurements anyway, and
So we got interest on both sides. I guess for those that said, forget it, don't waste your time, is that purely just from a work standpoint? Because if it is, doesn't sound like it's that much work.
It
Or
sounded like it was.
you have another reason why you think we shouldn't do it.
So this is the first critical groundwater designation under Division 10. It's gonna come under a lot of scrutiny. If it's the recharge area, I think we should want and desire to have the measuring report.
yeah,
The next one, it might be more than 80 acres. It might be 2,000 acres.
yeah.
And somebody wants to make the argument it shouldn't be there. So just for consistency in the process, I would like to see the classification and the greater Hardy Valley area concern is an area that was made up in statute or made up in rule. It's not actually an administrative area of any kind, except what we did in rule. And in fact, if you look at it, there's a little carve out there that probably only 2 of us in this whole room, maybe not even extended, knows why that carve out's there. It's not a real delineation in anything else except the 2016 rule. But I'd like to see the classification here.
I agree.
Is the
There's a little-
is the curve out around you?
No, it's not. It's actually an include.
Yeah, I was gonna say, is it happening that? Yeah, so Andy, you mentioned leave it out, you were carried away.
He is about, I'm good.
Yeah,
I was trying to save the operator some money.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like it's much money, so let's go ahead and.
Oh, you don't know yet. And then the map packet has the proposed critical groundwater area boundary in there, but we're not gonna talk about that today. That's just for you to be able to clearly see what that boundary is. And thanks, Fred, for your suggestion last time that we put a packet together like this.
Really helpful, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay,
So there, Andy, the way in which Fred's feedback was taken into account.
That was.
You wanna help me? I read 17 or 18 on the other day.
okay, let's, move right along.
I mean, I was.
Okay, updated RAC process. All right, this is what we were alluding to. Oh, sorry.
Was that last slide is the critical groundwater area, right? We're not talking about it today.
Okay. Update to the RAC process. All right, so. Everybody listen up. So this is, I alluded to this earlier and we've been talking about it throughout. Now we're there. That there's a lot of work that's got to go into all these different topics. Looks like you got copies now. We're able to get them done on a break. So everyone's got the new table. But these topics are going to require a lot of work. So we have developed, well, I haven't. When I say we, I'm going to pass this on. There has been a proposal for how some discussion groups could be developed to help create opportunity for deeper dives, more discussion on these topics. So that we can come to them with more information and more preparation. The level of participation here is collaborate, and that's only in that, but that's in the sense of, we want to know from you, do you want this or not? It's really something that has been proposed, and I'm going to turn it to Brenda because we want to keep these discussion groups removed from the official RAC process. So between High Desert Partnership and Oregon Consensus, they'll take some ownership and leadership of what this looks like. Okay, so next slide, Tim.
Yeah, so, I think, you know, we've we've recognized, over the last couple of RACs, you know, we're a community that has been asked to collaborate with place-based planning and sort of put our full input and, so we're really a very hands-on, community as that goes. And so we've come to understand sort of the expectations of what happens in Iraq. But I think it's still really important that we have, the conversation. And so with that, we have, and when I say we, High Desert Partnership, some members of the RAC, have been talking with Oregon Consensus and Oregon Solutions, and that's a statewide program that's housed at Portland State University. Oregon Consensus, does a lot of facilitation work, in projects all across the state. So, they have actually been involved with a number of our collaboratives in High Desert Partnership. Bobby Cochran was at the last RAC meeting, and he is one of the Oregon Consensus facilitators. So sort of recognizing sort of the level of discussion that we want to have around the RAC process, but continue to keep the RAC process on track as much as possible. We'd like to support folks in having discussions so that that can come back to the RAC, not as decisions, I guess, but it would be open to any RAC members, any members of the public. It would involve being facilitated by Bobby Cochran, Oregon Consensus. High Desert Partnership really never does the facilitation. We always bring in third-party facilitators. So I'm not a facilitator. So we're really just trying to support having community voice and community conversations across diverse groups. So this would be to explore options, discuss pros and cons. And so all of our role would be is to help set up these meetings, and it would be facilitated by Bobby. And then what we're hoping would happen is that we can get the topics that need to be discussed from the RAC. And I think that's the next piece of this puzzle. And if it doesn't feel super clear, I think it's not exactly clear, but I do think we're getting a lot more clarity around how this could work and how we can sort of, I guess, make this more beneficial for everyone, including this part. So, yeah.
So any questions about what, I mean, and as Brenda said, this is all kind of, this is building as we speak, so maybe all the details aren't ironed out, but, any questions about what's being proposed here? Yeah.
Yes, so these are the meetings that will occur outside the RAC to have education, maybe come to some shared understandings and possibly develop some proposals for further consideration, correct?
Correct. And just kind of what Brenda was just alluding to, what we're talking about next is, in order for those to be successful, we need to start to identify what do you need for each one of those. So we'll talk about, because that's gonna be a lot of work for, like department to feed these groups. So that, but yes, that's correct.
And I'll also to add that, Brian, right, you're still involved. And you know, as the reason you are involved is because the RAC requested support and facilitation of these meetings. And so that's helpful to continue that, and we want that to happen.
Thank you. Yeah. So I'm remaining in my role as facilitator of this group. I'll be already talking to Bobby just about every other day, and I'll probably talk to him every day now. But so he'll be leading that, and we'll be coordinating so we can make sure what's coming out of that is getting its way in here. And ideally, then when we can kind of hit the ground running sometimes on these topics in the RAC. Jeff?
Just to add to that, Brian, so it gives you an opportunity to really dive in deep to some of these topics you're struggling with. But it also, it'll enable the department to become more of a true participant in the conversation versus trying to manage the whole thing. And so it'd be a different dynamic than what you have right here, so hopefully you come up with some alternatives that the RAC can pursue.
Seems like a good idea, Fred.
I think it's sort of what Ken Barely was. And I thought that part of what he said made sense, that on some of these things, the department struggled and we've struggled, you know, with, is alleyway laid in concrete or not? Because there hasn't been formal alternatives discussed or really analyzed. Maybe the department's analyzed a number of alternatives, but they never really came to us on the RAC, so, if it can be a vehicle that's helpful to do that, these things are complicated and sometimes, there's really some really basic alternatives that, why didn't we think of that, you know, a year and a half ago? And, especially when you're talking about language on permissible decline or rate of decline, big difference between decline and rate of decline. All those things, anyway, just might be helpful, it's gonna be hard to get people, I mean, right now, we have a whole bunch of people who need to be here. They're too busy working. I called one of them on the way in, hoping he'd be here, and somebody was out of water and he had to go help them.
So one thing, maybe you mentioned this, Brenda, but I didn't hear it. So you're the first bullet there, open to the public, what, like, who can participate?
Yeah, I think, you know, it's message to any interested, public member, where, you know, we don't have the master list for messaging for public comment, but and I think that was a little bit of a, not sure how we get that out.
So there's gonna be, so I guess the difference here is the RAC is, you know, has some official sideboards around it. This has less of that. So, but as Brenda's saying, you're gonna, you know, kind of need to talk to your neighbors and stuff to get people involved.
Would it, be available on Zoom, whatever?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's the anticipated. That'd be awesome.
You're all muted on it, but.
And no camera.
The location's gonna be secret every time.
You want to leave your.
You're welcome to listen.
Sit outside of the porch and listen.
Well, you brought up Fred, is it possible to have OWRD person there or something, to let us know if we've gone beyond something we can actually impact? I mean, I hate for a group to spend a week or two coming up with something that we didn't even have the authority to change in the first place.
Good idea.
I think that's.
I think Tim should be there so we can yell at you.
I think Tim.
I heard you had extra time.
Yeah.
If I'm on mute and off camera, while you're yelling.
We'll text you, Tim.
Trust me, I'm there. Okay, so we can dig into this now unless anybody has any other questions about the process. Okay, let's keep on trucking. Okay, so what we want to do now is help make those successful, these discussion groups. So just Kelly, are you gonna, I'll do this slide here, but then I'm gonna turn it over to Kelly. But the goal here is gather feedback to prepare future meeting topics and determine level of discussion groups each warrants. Questions to be answered. How much discussion is needed for each topic? What topics could an outside discussion group take on? So we need he's gonna walk through some topics. You need to say that one needs a group and they need to meet a lot. And they're gonna need all this information to be successful. That's what we need to know. And I need to try to caution everyone. Do try not to dive into these topics. The point is, these things are deep dives. We need to set ourselves up for success on these, but if we try to start diving in now, we're never gonna get through this list. It's a big list. And we can continue getting feedback. I mean, this doesn't have to be the end all, but level of participation is collaborate, because we need to know what you want to know. Okay, but don't be offended if I stop you and say, we're going too deep into this. We're not gonna talk about the topic. We just need to know what you need to talk about the topic. Understood? Okay. All right, Kelly.
All right, thanks, Brian. Yeah, so we're gonna kind of go through these highlighted list of topics. We're gonna try to get your input as well, gather input on other topics like physical impact and voluntary agreements, and kind of gauge what information you need, as Brian said, and how much conversation is warranted and needs to be done by these outside discussion groups outside of the RAC. So go ahead and next slide, please. So when we talk about model management scenarios, right? And I think we briefly talked about this when we were talking about the milestones, not decision points. Thank you, Lisa. We need to really consider what are the goals for the groundwater levels in Harney Basin, how we can delineate this critical groundwater area, how we can delineate sub areas within that critical groundwater area, and then when it comes to taking, I'm going to say, just for lack of better words, taking the sub areas through a contested case, how are we prioritizing those sub areas? Which ones are going to go first, right? So an example of that is in our proposed model, our management scenario, we have the 6 high priority sub areas. We're targeting those first for groundwater reduction. And then the next question would be, how long will we take to fully implement that permissible total withdrawal, right? And then how are we going to allocate that permissible total withdrawal? So these are all topics that I think we really need to talk about when we go through the next 3 RACs and talk about model management scenarios. Next slide, please. So this is just kind of grabbed from our input, our RAC input document that we sent out and updated it. And what I want to do is kind of look at, okay, what input do we still need from you guys? What other input should we get from you guys? Because right now, for the goal for groundwater levels in Harney Basin, we're asking you, okay, which of the 3 options should be the goals, right? So should it be recovery? Should it be stabilizing groundwater levels immediately? Or should we go for some sort of glide path where we allow for manage the depletion of the groundwater over a short term until we fully implement that PTW? And just a note on that RAC input document, that is a living document, and we're going to keep changing that document based off of the input that we have received. And it's our document, okay, here's the input we've heard, here's what we did with that input on that document. And I'm going to be working with Bobby a little bit later to do that. So starting with goals for groundwater levels in the Harney Basin, can we go to the next slide? The 3 questions that I kind of want to get out. Okay, so what are we not considering? Are there options that we should consider? So, outside of the recovery, we're allowing for managed declines or immediate stabilization. And then what barriers need to be removed for a thoughtful input on the goal for groundwater levels in the Harney Basin? And Brian, I'm going to throw it back to you. So
Is there something we're not considering?
Could we go back to the slide where?
Yeah.
Yeah.
To digest it. We talked about it a couple times, but the economic impact and stuff in the PTWs, and I know if we start talking about the PTWs and adjusting, we need to also, when we're talking about it, and have the economic impact on how it's gonna affect, to try to see if we can do a balance that's not so harsh. Work out.
Okay. I want to hear from someone on the RAC if that's something that's considered.
I would say, yeah, I mean, heavily. I'd go back to one more slide, because I think one more slide was actually the breakout potential.
Well, what's so hard if you don't know I mean, you really don't know the economic impact until you know what PTW is.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? I mean, basically. So, you know, if you don't know the PTW, you really can't have a plan.
Yeah, and there's gonna be an economic impact discussion here as well, but understanding these are all interplaying.
So. I guess without diving too far into it, when we talk about goals, right? It's goals, groundwater levels, because the purpose of this rulemaking, why we're here, is because the department is supposed to determine and maintain reasonably stable groundwater levels. And that needs to be like the overarching frame of what we're trying to get to. And I totally understand that economic impacts are important and we need to understand those as we go along. But when we're talking about goals, we're really trying to drive into what is it we're required to do? And with that in mind, what is the time frame in which we get, like, in which we accomplish that?
So Tim, the key to that is the one word reasonable and the definition of it. And because everybody here is gonna have a different definition of what that means. And then economics comes quickly to the front of that. Sure. As to what the determination of what is reasonable. And so, I mean, that's gonna be at the end of the day, that's what the discussion is gonna be about. So I mean, we have three choices. We can do nothing.
Yep.
We can shut every irrigation pump off in the valley, or we can do something in between. And so to get to that in between will require we come to an agreement as to what the term reasonable means.
Okay, yep, and that's great. I appreciate that framing. Now, what do we need to have? How much conversation do we need to have around that? What information we want to have in front of us as we're having that sort of conversation?
Are we just talking about the goal conversation now?
Yep,
Sorry, Tim. Thank you.
yeah, just talking about goal. So,
Yeah, we'll talk about it, the fiscal impacts here, and maybe we determine that those discussion groups need to happen soon, not later. Yeah,
So a goal, I mean, I'm not gonna try to go into detail, stop me if I do.
okay.
But when we were talking about stable or reasonably stable, talking about sub-areas, we were talking about, the goal was, in my opinion, to take the worst case scenario and stabilize that. But maybe the goal is understanding what the medium groundwater stabilization would mean. Like Roger said, if some wells come up 20 feet over 30 years and some stay down or go down 20 feet, is that success because we levelize the water to the whole basin? So when we look at a goal, are we always going to the most acute problem saying we need stabilization there? Are we trying to have an equilibrium throughout the whole basin, which would achieve some sort of balance? I don't know.
so I really appreciate that, Mark, and I guess what I didn't hear is what more information can we provide to facilitate a conversation? Because it sounds like we just need to have a conversation about it.
Yeah, maybe it's more understanding of what the medium or mean. Well, I don't know, Tim. I mean, we can go back to those charts that presented 2, RAC 2 and 3. So I mean, I would have to give that some thought. I mean, I'll give one example. When we asked for 4 sub areas, Zach made the proposal, could we use the medium hydrograph level to figure out PTW? The department said, we'll consider that. And then when it came out, did not consider that.
Okay,
So, I mean,
Yeah.
that type of information is,
so it sounds like we need to have a conversation, probably a technical conversation around groundwater levels and how.
or is the goal to go to the most acute problem, or is the goal to try to take a
Right.
equilibrium?
And how the, like, challenges or concerns with how we would use them, how like averaging would work. What does that mean, right? Like, what's our spatial distribution for averaging? Because if we average Weaver Springs with, you know, a well that has just recovered last year 2 feet, that's totally different than if we average all of Weaver Springs together and then average all of like the wells in Sylvia's together or the wells in Crane together. Right? And so maybe we need to have a conversation around that. And I think that's a dark sort of conversation around like how you monitor the system and understand what's happening as you make changes. Would that be helpful in this goals conversation?
Absolutely.
How do you measure? success?
Absolutely, because we can measure, we can measure failure. But we can't today measure success. Exactly right. And so how do we measure success? And that means we have to clearly define that, otherwise we're gonna sit around, shut the whole basin down and try to bring Weaver Springs back up.
Sure.
And so, I mean, that's not practical.
So what we can do, what I'll propose here is, a lot of us are capturing the notes on each one of these items. Maybe what we can do is really try to get this turned back around quickly so you could look at it and say, yeah, you got it, or you forgot, you need to add this, so that we have this good list so that they can start working on the information that's needed for these groups. But what I'm hearing is, we got some items here and there's a discussion group warranted here. Oh, sorry.
So maybe this changes the, subject just a little bit, but a couple of types of information that might be helpful for this goal setting are, one, what happens to domestic wells around the basin under different scenarios? I know in the groundwater allocation rules, there was some analysis run on, this level of decline affects this many domestic wells, but here we might also be talking about, well, if we recover the groundwater level, how many domestic wells does that help, right? So pulling some of that data might be helpful. And then, just maybe the same point, but looking at, springs and streams, which it sounds like USGS has done quite a bit of that in their model. What are the implications of setting the goals in different ways on that kind of capacity of the resource issue, which is also part of the section.
So, we'll have to think on that
Yeah,
one.
okay.
I'll talk with Art about that and how we provide information that's helpful to that goals conversation. Thank you.
Well, it seems like we would also need to have a better understanding of how the different substrate, if it truly is one. I'm thinking aquifer, but what was the other term?
Groundwater reservoir.
Groundwater reservoir. Then there's going to be some sort of a rate of equilibrium. But that's going to differ between the substrates. If we're talking about median, or going to the worst case, or whatever, we need to understand in time, that's going to start adjusting as equilibrium is sought underground. And so what are the impacts of that? Because our data is just a few years. And it doesn't seem like it's capturing that picture for us to have a better understanding of what might be a reality 20 years from now, or whatever. Because all of a sudden things could shift like that we didn't anticipate because we weren't anticipating those adjustments in a good way.
Okay. Let me think on that one. And I may reach out to you, follow.
Okay, let's go back, let's jump ahead a couple slides here to see if there's other questions on this. So, anything else, helpful to feed this topic? Kelly, anything that you want to know?
I guess I want to know. So I think the word barriers I chose very deliberately. When we talk about these conversations, and I say information and barriers, I mean, not outside of the department providing information, is there something that you guys, and I mean the RAC, you group members of this group can do to start talking about this conversation? Or is there something stopping you from having this conversation? I'm sorry if that seemed blunt. I'm not trying to seem blunt. I'm just trying to figure out, okay, is it just purely the department needs to provide this information, or we just need to have the space to have the conversation now? I guess is what I'm trying to get out of that question.
So I think the department will have to provide some of the information on where do you measure success?
Okay.
And how, I mean, are we gonna pick 10 central wells in a different area that we agree on, or what are we gonna do? Are we gonna take the average of the wells? Are we gonna take my well on Crane, like with turbine oil on top? What are we gonna do?
Okay.
I mean, that isn't part of, is that any part of what you guys have worked on? What is success? What is success?
Stabilizing groundwater. Now, it's a much more nuanced conversation than that, and I don't wanna drive into that right now, because we will go down the rabbit hole. And but we need to have a conversation about it. You're out. Absolutely.
I think all these, everything here is driving us to that answer to that. Yeah, Fred.
Yeah, the thought I've had all along, on some of this is, and it's come up in meetings where like on conservation, everybody says, I've been doing X, Y, Z for many years. Am I going to get credit for it when we come around, you know, finalize rules? That's a big issue for a lot of people. Been using less water, I've been conserving water, I've redefined, do the transfer where I'm putting the water so that it's more productive, you know, all sorts of things. Some of those things cost a lot of money and there's actually obstacles and no incentive to do some of those things. So my thought all along is a lot of times we're missing, you know, we're looking at glass half full and, you know, half empty, you know, that a final rule or different parts of the rule need the positive side of the legislature. You know, and this process could do that, I think. As an example, none of the opportunities for recharge, artificial recharge or natural recharge, you know, really, there's no placeholder in the rule. It's on the positive side of the ledger, where as a community, it would be great to be able to tell the community, we get good forest management, good gym management, and we show some freshettes that turn positive. There should be somehow credit given to the process. It's like, okay, we have a rate of decline and we change that rate. So it's a smaller decline, and then you take time and you look at why did it happen? What do we need? You know, where's the positive incentive that did that, or is it just, you know, where do you get credit for it at the very least? Anyway, I think the positive side of the ledger has been left out because people want to make the decline better. And while we're all brainstorming on that, we miss looking at things that could really make a difference in some areas.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Let's keep moving here. We have a lot of topics we want to run through. We just want to try to get what we can. And again, you know, if I move off one, doesn't mean you can't keep contributing to it. So let's jump to the next one here. Kelly?
Okay, yeah. Think about these management scenarios and running these in the USGS model. Starting on the end, like the most, we have the goal, in my mind, it's the goals, the most outer is the umbrella, and underneath that next layer, I guess, is the critical ground area boundary. So how we are going to define within the model, the boundary of the critical ground area. So but basically the question, the input that we think we want to receive from the RAC is what should be the boundary of the Harney Basin critical groundwater area? And the options are that we have right now are defining the critical groundwater as the Greater Valley groundwater area of concern, the GIVGAC, or we've heard, this is an option, an input we've heard from some of the RAC members, is defining the critical groundwater area. I think Mark just mentioned this, around the areas of most severe decline. So those are some options. There are plenty other options on the table, but going to the next slide, right? Three same questions. Can I go next slide? Okay. Is there something that we're not considering in terms of the critical groundwater area? Are there other options that we could potentially consider outside of the just defining the critical ground area as the GAC or defining the critical ground area as the more severe areas of decline? And then again, what information do we need to provide to you, so you can provide thoughtful input on the critical ground area boundary? So we can go back to the next slide, the previous slide, I mean.
Brief, discussion as to what critical groundwater area, how that impacts. Mark, how does that impact irrigator?
How does it impact irrigators? So.
Don't try to answer it. These are areas for, discussion.
Thank you. My one would be is in RAC 1 and 2, we talked about potentially having triggers. And it was at one time said by Ivan that, yeah, triggers are fine, but sometime around RAC 3 or 4, triggers went out of the conversation and we said we couldn't. So I'm not saying that we would say the whole area needs to be a critical groundwater designation, but if it is, I think one of the biggest concerns for a lot of people in here that a critical groundwater designation proposed by the department comes with a PTW. In Division 10, it doesn't say shall. No. It says may. Mm-hmm. We have concerns that this will be the first critical groundwater designation since the new rules, and that if a PTW is listed, even if the department says they're not going to go to a contested case, that the public or members of the public will have, some of them will say, wait, no, you said what the permissible photo withdrawal is. Now you're not enforcing. Enforce. The department said, no, we don't believe that could happen, but that fear is a rational reality for this community. So as we talk about critical groundwater designations, is there an area where part of them can be designed, because we don't want more development in there either, and that's the first thing it does. But then there would be groundwater triggers for contraction. So if Donner and Blitzen dropped 25 more foot on whatever our goal is, the department at that time then would come forward to the PTW and say, we're potentially going to start a contested case. The department could be watching that for a period of years, and 2 years before that triggered, they could actually be making the PTW on what's occurred in the last decade or 2 decades. Maybe that takes the edge off the critical groundwater designation as a whole. So I think maybe what we could use is what could possibly be used to prevent a PTW in areas that have not tripped statutory marks or aren't declining at a faster rate. Wow, that was, listening to you two on, I went deep on that.
No. Chris?
Mark.
All right, that's good. Good discussion could happen on that.
Hey, Mark,
Kelly?
let me see if I understand. So the information, the information that you think would be helpful for thoughtful input, PTW is the concern, and I understand that, is how could the community possibly prevent implementation of the PTW in a particular area? Or I'm hearing triggers, but
Not prevent implementation of PTW. There's some areas that I think some members around this table, the department agree that we're gonna say shouldn't be a critical groundwater designation. My understanding is the department's probably gonna say they should. So our concern is, Kelly, the listing of the PTW in a sub area of the critical groundwater designation. You don't have to list a PTW. If you don't list a PTW, you very potentially take away what could manifest itself into a lawsuit against the department for implementation. Sure.
Gotcha. Understood. Thank you, Mark.
So that to me sounds like part of the conversation should be around what the department may or may not be able to do in relation to the rules and the structuring of PTW as it relates to sub areas within the boundary that we designate. Is that fair?
Fair to a point. So Division 10 specifically says may list the PTW, so we know it doesn't have to be. So if it doesn't have to be, don't list it, but I think we could all talk that maybe it's reasonable to have it triggered. And if we've heard 2 different things from the department, yes, we could have triggers, no, we couldn't, if we can. What is
Yeah.
What was, what's, what's
So
the
that's the conversation we need to have. And I'm not gonna drive into that. because,
No, yeah, that's-
I don't have time, but that's helpful. Thank you.
Can I just add to that, which is, yeah, I think, I mean, my interest would be structuring this in a way to, obviously, to prevent getting into trouble. Bad trouble in areas where we're not in trouble already. So, you know, a PTW or some tool like that, where you say, like, we need to get here. Eventually, we need to not pass this. Or however we structure it. I mean, I think it's part of the same conversation that you're kind of teeing up, but maybe from a little different angle, which is, you know, I don't want to get in a situation where, you know, 7 years down the road, we realize now we've got another problem. And now we're 5 years reopening the rules, and then we're 5 years to, you know, and pretty soon I mean, I've been doing this for 20 years. Pretty soon you're 20 years down the road and you're in a lot of trouble. So I think just structuring it, somehow structuring it so that we can keep areas safe.
So trouble meaning the groundwater situation or?
Yeah. Trouble meaning you cause declines that you are trying to avoid causing. And
Those
now,
triggers would do the same thing, wouldn't it?
right, that's what I'm saying, is there's probably different ways to structure it,
Right.
and we just, I think, need to have that conversation.
Yeah, I think what everyone's sharing is the framework for what the conversation would be
Yeah.
built around.
Exactly.
Okay,
Those with the
So-
options. You kind of have it's too hot or too cold. It's almost like we need a Goldilocks option. That's somewhere in the middle as well. So those seem to be kind of limiting.
We have
I mean-
Dominic Carrillo online. Sorry, Lisa, not to interrupt, who has her hand up, Brian, just letting you know.
okay, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So I would just reiterate, dovetail off what Rep Owens had to say. I mean, I think for a variety of practical and legal reasons, I don't think Harney County has a definitive position on whether there should be one really big critical groundwater area designation or separate ones, but I would just submit that I really do think it'd be a mistake for the department to not present an alternative where there were separate CGWAs designated over the areas of most severe decline. I think for a variety of reasons, it's going to be a mistake if the department doesn't present that to the RAC as an alternative and explain what the different practical and legal ramifications would be of that.
Okay, all right, got that. Separate areas and ramifications. Okay, let's go to the next one. Again, we're not closing the door on any of these, but we just want to make sure we get some feedback so that this department can plan accordingly. Kelly, go ahead and introduce this one.
Yep. So again, thinking in terms of working with you guys to develop these model management scenarios in the USGS model, how should we? I use the word delineate the input, but really what I'm trying to get is how should we carve up whatever boundary we decide? How should we carve that up, right? And so we have right now the options that we propose with our management scenario is we delineate by the groundwater flow path, the hydraulic gradient, the ground level water level trends, and the subsurface geology. And so from the input that we think we want, and please tell me if there's other input that you guys think we should give, are there additional criteria to consider, right? And really framing this conversation around those model management scenarios. How should we carve this thing up? And then same 3 questions on the next slide. So
And I guess also consider, you know, if this isn't something that requires a deep dive, that's okay.
I think you're gonna want to deep dive on this one.
No, that's fine. I just want to give people the option that you don't have to. Say that.
So I'll lead again. I do think this is where, when we talked to Steve earlier today, the groundwater model could be instrumental in trying to figure out management direction. I'm not sure, I mean, the 3 of the department takes, understand, they can back those, but Steve has some maps there of 2018, you know, that showed areas that would recover faster than others. I think there's some broader strokes here that we could talk about potentially for sub areas and meet the same goals. I mean, it was obvious that those areas right by the bifurcation of the water don't seem to have much of an issue. So maybe they're delineated out. The east side, when you talk North Harney, Crane, Buchanan, Crane, a lot of us think those should be grouped up. They're not getting much recharge from the facilities. They're getting those independent streams. I don't know exactly what that criteria is, but I think that model could help us. We actually just sit down and we sketch areas, maybe based off some of the maps that Steve showed us today. And come up with potential areas to run. We've also looked at the Huck 8 maps, because they're recharge areas that seem to make some sense and might have some similar active wells outside of those areas. I know on this one, it was put in one of the things is no other input or no other recommendations were given for. We're struggling with how to give that. We've met multiple times, multiple hours trying to do that. But I think there's some mapping that we can do. With the model.
Hi, Mark, and when we have this conversation and start developing those management scenarios that we're going to input into the model, that is a mouthful to say. Would it be help? Because you just mentioned whether we have a map and you start drawing out the areas, would it be helpful to have just a large map in the room and take a pen and start dividing it out?
We've already done that at least 16 or 17, so that'd be a good place to start, but also might be a good place to start is to look at some of those maps that Steve showed us today. And base it off some of the scenarios that he already ran on the model.
Okay.
There's one or two that really stuck in my mind that showed how they would respond.
And those are in the model report. Really, and we'll make the presentation available as well.
For the purposes of the discussion group he's describing, I mean, that's what, having those maps and virtually drawing lines and, you know. Anything else needed for this?
I would say one thing, and not everybody's gonna agree with this probably, but I would think that one thing would come up when people start giving input would be scrutiny on the level of data that's in the system on which the decision was made. And it kind of goes back to areas that don't have any historical information. Some areas have some really old information. Some areas just have a little, not very much data at all for reasons. That comes up all the time in my conversations with people, both groundwater irrigators and others. So I've always been uncomfortable with that. But sometimes we're picking and choosing data, you know, and there's a lot more out there that's not being used in those sorts of scenarios. Just a recognition of the confidence level in the amount of data, not necessarily the quality of data. I've always said more information, more data on these water level measurements as a community tells us a whole, heck, we do that on our own. Every well, we monitor twice a year during pumping and of course in March. You know, we have a lot of, we want to see where what is impacting the water level measurement at the time of the year. It's good information, and I just feel like some areas we're assuming stuff that we really don't, maybe ought to be assuming due to level of data, historical data that's not there, whatever. Level of data in the analysis and the decision-making arena, something like that. I just think that that's something we ought to keep coming back to a little bit as we go along.
Hey Fred, what analysis do you need in terms of the data that we have now, right, from 2018, do you need so you feel comfortable in providing valuable input? Because yeah, you mentioned this a lot, and I really want to get that. I want you to have feel like you're comfortable with getting input.
If there's an area there, a whole bunch of people are concerned that that's just not what's going on there. That level of input, might be questions back to the department. It's sort of like Mark asked quite a bit, are all the wells on that map, you know what I'm saying? Or are we picking and choosing 5 wells on there? You know, the difference between static orderly and, monitor permit. Monitoring wells on individual permits. People don't understand that, and it's a big deal in where they're coming from on this process. I would really be consumed with it if I was in the middle of a Crane Buchanan area or Princeton or anything, because you know, when you have 40 wells and we're looking at 5, I'm just saying, it's not necessarily bad to look at 5. I'm just saying, you gotta keep going back and revisiting it a little bit. It's a consideration by the community. It's a big consideration by individual irrigators.
Thank you, Fred.
The next one, really, maybe these would be combined as, but this is, go ahead. Joe.
So when we eventually get to the point in the conversation where we have divided up we decided the goal and how we measure the goal, right? I hear that. And then we do the boundary, and then we delineate the bound. I'm sorry, I'm speaking with my hands. You guys can't see it. But when we delineate the critical ground area boundary, then how do we prioritize groundwater reductions, right? So with our current proposed management scenario, we're prioritizing sub areas by decline rate in magnitude and or the cone of depression, and we categorize that into higher or lower priorities. And then we said that we are going to focus on the higher priority sub areas. So that was our proposed criteria, but what other criteria should we be using to prioritize areas for groundwater reductions? And the slide's going to be a broken record, but go ahead, Tim. Yep.
Yeah, it's the same 3 questions.
Let's make it specifically criteria, is what you're looking for.
Yeah.
You go back.
Yep.
If it's hydraulically connected, I struggle with that philosophy. You know what I'm saying? And the model says it's hydraulically connected, so, I mean, how does that work in your guys' mind? I mean, what? You know, because you say there's a cone of depression over here, or you say, you know, but then you go across the highway and you don't manage that. I mean, I don't understand how it works. I mean, I don't see it the way you guys do.
I guess the question would be, I would have, is this discussion dependent on the previous one in a way? You know, do we just put a pin in this because the discussion that we just talked about is going to influence where this goes?
I mean, I think they're all dependent.
Yeah.
They're all dependent. Yeah. We're going to get more and more into the weeds as we could go to each one of these topics. And it's going to get more and more and more specific.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think what we're trying to drive towards here, Kelly, correct me if I'm wrong, but is it even necessary to prioritize regulatory action? Do we want to focus on the areas of most decline, or do we want to do this basin wide? Like what makes the most sense there? And we've talked about timing and how the different areas respond at different time frames, and recharge is further away from some areas and closer to other areas. Do we want to take that into account as we target actions? And I've heard Mark and others say, like, let's not focus just on the worst area, right? And And so that is part of this question is, should we just focus on the worst areas? Should we prioritize them? And so maybe action happens there first, and then action cascades down to other areas as we like start to see responses in the system, so regulation. So that's what we're trying to drive at here, and what information do we need to have inform that sort of conversation around taking action.
If you do allow triggers a different part of the critical groundwater designation, those triggers would then force another action, which would be when they would self-prioritize themselves when you hit different levels. So not saying that some of them already haven't hit any triggers that's reasonable to mankind. I mean, there's probably other areas that haven't. So it might be, if we work through the other ones, they might prioritize themselves.
Okay.
Site-specific component, site-specific well conditions must be paramount in this process. You cannot ignore that in trying to administer on a broad basis. Sub-area delineation helps, but site-specific well conditions and levels must be a big part on the front end and on the back end.
John, I saw you were like up and down with your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, it mentions a few things there, the decline rate, magnitude, and or cone of depression, and it sure seems like the rate of decline is the one we need to focus on in an area, because that area has only recently been developed and have a strong rate of decline, sure, versus some other ones. Drop 20 feet, but it's taken 100 years to do it.
Sure, so it sounds like to me, I'm inferring what you might want to look at there is one, we're updating the water level trends document to provide the latest water level trends in 2024, spring 2024 data. But then also maybe historic use and match like use uplift trends. Is that? Because you said like some areas may have been developed for a long time and have seen a long gradual trend as opposed to some areas developed recently and very steep. So, would that be helpful?
Well, to me, it seems like the higher priority, if you're gonna prioritize two different ones, the one that has a steeper rate of decline it needs to be the highest priority.
Okay, yep, that's fair.
I don't know if this is possible, if you have the ability to do this, but what about susceptibility of springs and streams as a part of that? And the reason why I bring that up is, as was discussed earlier, Sawhouse Spring, a substantial spring dried up, and that didn't hit any of WRD's triggers or alerts that there could be a problem, and that spring's gone now. And so talking with folks in the 00 community and the BLM, we're all very concerned about the springs in the 00 area and the lake above that. There could be something that this isn't triggering, that all of a sudden that tremendous resource to our county is just gone, but it hasn't hit just yet because there's enough head that's lost that the water's just no longer coming up. And so is there a way that we can consider that in this as well?
Yeah, so I think that model report is helpful there, right? Like what we saw, there were springs and streams that were called out and changes in pumping resulted in either like substantial recovery of springs and stream discharge and or not in different areas. So I think that is something we can consider, and we will have to think through how to. We could probably start with the model as an effective way of talking about it. And then I think it'll be testing it as we go through. That's a really good call.
The understanding on the front end is.
Yeah.
Alexandria, did you have something?
Yeah, I'm not on the RAC, but I'm gonna put on my community-based water planning hat for a second and, chime in since Holly Rondo. I don't know if she's here online, but something else the group might consider that was a recommendation from the place-based planning group was to prioritize areas where there's groundwater dependent ecosystems, to prioritize efforts there. So if you guys are thinking about criteria that may be important, that's something that was viewed as important by the Harney Community-Based Water Planning Collaborative.
Okay, let's, so Kelly, I'm gonna check in with you. So, I guess first question for you is, are you good? Anything else you want to know about this? And then I would ask, I just want to confirm with you, are these, as we go through these, are these in the order in which the department needs to know the answers the most? I just want to make sure if we come up against time, you got the most urgent information.
I think they're all pretty equal. I think what we're going to find as we go through these is that we're going to get in more and more minutia detail. So we started broadly with the goals and then the boundary, and we're really filtering down into how long should we implement the PTW? How should we allocate the PTW in the next like two big questions? And I guess what I'm getting out of here is one, and I think we already knew this, management scenarios definitely needs more discussion. And probably from this outside discussion group. Right, we can all agree there, correct?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Totally.
So I think we could probably, and I'll look to the group, I think we could probably move on to the physical impact statement, trying to get more data, but I'll look to the group. And yeah.
Yeah, so the physical impacts conversation is maybe a little bit different in the sense that we started this conversation last meeting, but we need to know, parties know what they don't know, and where's data, what available data or what sources of information needs to be sought so they can begin to prepare for this. Because this is an important conversation. It's gonna be a multi-meeting conversation. So it's, the sooner the department can start working on this, the better.
So do we want to continue going through those, or do we want to jump ahead to like,
Well,
management scenarios and then?
we can jump ahead to fiscal and then come back into the order we were in, just so that we make sure we capture that. While we do that.
Yeah, okay, so there's fiscal.
Okay, you wanna present that, Kelly?
Yeah, right. Okay, so March 6th, we had a conversation about the physical impact statement, and this is just kind of what I heard. So hay production trickle down effects from loss of revenue. We need to consider hay reduction impacts to cow stocking rates and trickle down to small businesses. We need to, and we've heard this today too, consider property value, so designating critical ground area and how that affects property taxes. You need to consider the impacts to non-business farms, so businesses that rely on farming agriculture, and then also need to consider the impacts of just doing nothing if we were not to do any regulation. And so I took that feedback, next slide real quick. And this is the information that I gathered based off the input, right? So we have the business case that we hired for a study for economic value. We have the USDA Census of Agriculture 2022, and the Oregon Department of Employment data. And then I think a member from the public during our March 6th meeting recommended to get the Eco Northwest Harney Basin groundwater market study. And so I have I think the final version. I got it yesterday afternoon for from Eco Northwest. And then the data that I still need to gather, next slide, please, is I still need to reach out to the utilities, the Harney Electric Cooperative. I need to acquire the Harney Basin Groundwater CREP programmatic impact statement. I guess they did a economic impact statement on what it would look like to take off 20,000 acres. I need to determine this, and these are all from the comments that I received, multiplier from the Oregon Economics Departments regarding trickle-down effects of job loss, And then also find data on land value losses versus land value gains. What other sources of information can you guys think that will help us provide a economic impact analysis? And again, it's all kind of tethers on what management scenario we select, but right now we're in the data gathering phase still.
I guess two thoughts. One is, and maybe this was captured on a previous slide, but sort of looking at avoided costs, you know, if you take action, for example, the CREP programs, what, $45 million of public money. Both the well remediation funds for the domestic wells, the Wharf and then the Harney Basin specific ones, that's more public money going to address problems caused by decline. So there's sort of an avoided cost part of the fiscal impact statement. I think that's, you know, if we do address the problem, we avoid a lot of public costs and private costs. So that's one thing. And then the other one I don't really see captured in here, and I know it is in the business statement for Oregon, but sort of the economic impacts of impacting groundwater dependent ecosystems. And actually, if you think about that USGS study this morning, where a third of the impacts of the drawdown came out in ET, which is like groundwater dependent ecosystem of one sort, and a third of it came out in reduced stream flow and spring flow. So really 2/3 of the impacts are on GDE. So, you know, what are the economic impacts? And I know the refuge obviously has a chunk of that economic value, but it's also hunting and bird watching and, you know, other.
Yeah.
I think we should reach out to somebody from Headwaters or Eco Northwest and ask them this question. What information does the department need in order to do this impact statement? None of us regulars here, bring somebody in.
We did that, right? Didn't we have a proposal and then,
We did.
yeah, we got to a certain point and
And I
then.
could reach out to John Ollie, Oregon Business, and see if they still have it.
I actually have access to that, Mark. I got that I reached out to Eco Northwest and they gave me the first part 1, I believe.
We did. No.
But I mean, I'd just sit down, Kelly, or maybe we do it on one of our breakout groups, or bring somebody in for a half hour an hour and say, here's the stuff you should be looking at.
Yeah, it sounds like, I mean, there's certainly a discussion group here, and maybe there's an extra party that comes in with some extra people.
Anything else on this?
Yeah, anything else? Yeah.
On the Harney Electric, the electrical co-ops, just remind everybody, it's not just the impact to them, you know, in terms of cost. But remember that they have that big fixed cost then spread over to a lot of users, and so the cost to the individuals, some of the same people we're trying to help, you know, can be exponentially very, very large when we look at power costs for people's homes.
I'm just thinking we probably all could go back to our community-based groundwater plan because there's a lot of references and we did spend a lot of time.
Yeah.
Yes.
A thought, I don't know if it would be on the fiscal impact, but what about because we're talking about groundwater dependent ecosystems, there's an impact that has. Well, our irrigated fields are a type of a groundwater dependent ecosystem. Just because we created them doesn't mean there's not a value to what we have. There's an ecosystem within irrigated fields to consider that we're losing wildlife.
There is actually new work out from
Yeah.
Intermountain Western Country. We just heard that yesterday. About what the irrigated lands in the west and throughout the chronic rivers.
You said, what was the?
Intermountain West Joint Venture.
Can you send us the Or whatever.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Anything else at this time? We can keep feeding this. Okay, so I guess Kelly, where do you want to go next? I'll let you steer us. What would be the next most important one to jump into?
I think we should just get buy-in, keep, if you go actually forward, Tim, I think we should just get buy-in on what conversations I think we need to have more discussion on in these outside discussion groups, right? So highlighted, model management scenario selection, which that entails all topics above it. So it's the goals, it's the boundaries, it's the delineation, the voluntary agreement guidelines for the Harney Basin, and the physical impact statement are really what I envision topics that the group should be talking about. But I want to throw it to you guys. I mean, that leaves out classification and SWAMPA, specifically what happens within the boundaries of those proposed areas. But that's what I'm envisioning, and I want to throw it to the group and just kind of, yeah, those are what we think we should be having discussions on in these outside groups.
And I'll help kind of frame that up, maybe just from a, commitment standpoint, right? I mean, certainly anything would benefit from more discussion, but that's more resources and more of your time to sit in more discussion groups. So maybe another way to look at it is, which of these are areas that we can address, discuss, and resolve in the RAC? Which ones are just too big to do that?
Has there ever been a voluntary agreement wrote in the state of Oregon?
Nope.
Never.
Nope. Yeah, but we, and that's not because it's so difficult, it's just because I don't think you need to try it.
Any thoughts beyond what's highlighted in yellow here? Just saying, yeah, this is big enough that we gotta, and we identified a number of things on those first few already. So I think we have some other discussion areas there identified. Or maybe look at the reverse, which ones are, we can like figure, we can do this.
I think it might help us all, because we've been here almost 4 hours to have a list of the ones that we talked about. And what maybe the department needs, and then we can send feedback to, hey, these are ones we think we should prioritize these. Yeah. Because I'm a little rummy myself now.
Yeah.
Typical, if you can say that.
We have 15 minutes left.
I'm sorry, I didn't even compute what you said before I said yeah, so.
I think that means.
Right, that's what I just agreed to.
Yeah, we could, Kelly, what do you think? You okay with sending this home? For homework?
Yeah, I'm okay with sending it home for homework. The only logistical problem is that I am out for 2 weeks, so it will. Cam, can I throw you on the pyre?
Yeah, we'll turn it around.
Kelly, we appreciate the effort you put into that to break out those different things. I know other people work with you to do it, but I think it's helpful and beneficial.
Thanks, Fred.
Thank you, Fred.
A lot of work all around, so appreciate everyone's commitment to this. Clearly, there's more work to do. We gotta keep on going. So, anybody else, public comment? Got one more public comment. Anybody, hold on one second. Anyone online, Kelly? Public comment?
Is Chris not with us today?
So if anyone wants to raise hands in chat and wants to make a public comment.
Okay, we'll go to anyone online here in a sec. We got one public comment here again, and 2 public comments. So again, try to keep it to comments. I'll share this. We got a lot of questions during last public comment, which is good. And there's nothing wrong with that. What would be helpful is, because I said, the department's not really prepared necessarily to answer these, or we have the time to put that into the agenda. But if we make sure we have your contact information, maybe include it on the sign-in sheet, that way we can connect you with the right person, so we can have some answers to the question. Go ahead.
So I think this was really good the last hour and a half before we were doing this stuff. And Are you guys still on the time frame of getting this all done by December? Because there's a lot there to go through. And it's gonna take a lot of subcommittees, I think, and a lot of extra work. I just wanna know if you're still forcing on that December time frame, because it looks like a lot. And it's gonna be a lot of dedication there won't be any vacations for any of us.
I'll say this, the RAC schedule that we're putting out here, that everyone has in front of them has a date in January 22nd, so right there. Okay, there's gonna be RAC meetings for the next year as of right now. Okay. I think that's
We have
it.
one more.
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah, Chad, I'm sorry.
So just follow up what Mark is suggesting, so if the RAC is gonna kind of digest this a little bit, what's the time frame that that's gonna occur in? The other thing is going to get public feedback or RAC questions, what's the process going to look like to get the information back to those folks?
Sure, yeah, so the process to get back to folks that provide questions in the comments is make sure we have your information so that we can circle back and connect you to the right person in the department that can answer questions. The process for turning this around, I think what I would put out there, and Tim, really weigh in, is if we'll get a condensed version of the meeting summary out soon on the items that we want to get back to you for feedback. It won't be the full summary. And that'll come later, but we'll try to, maybe that's something we can start to do more often is pick out the things that are important to get back to you quickly and send that out with the full summary to follow.
And then we can turn back, reply all, because you guys love that, but I appreciate it, to all the fact members, here's our feedback and who it came from.
Feedback,
You're asking for feedback, you're gonna put out,
whatever we get back from you. Yeah.
so we have time to potentially incorporate it before the next meeting, so when we get stuff out.
Yeah, we'll have to, yeah, I mean, it's gonna be some work, but yeah, there'll be some back and forth between now and the next RAC meeting.
I'm used to that.
Yeah.
That sure seems like that would reply all help.
Okay. Any process questions? Thanks for reminding me of those, Chad. Okay, yes.
I'll throw out one just last one that kind of raises my hackles in the back of my neck, because just when, you said part of including some of these areas in the critical groundwater was in part to keep the commission from being able to ever change it. And I thought the commission was your kind of board of directors, and kind of tying their hands doesn't sound like a very honorable direction to go. I'm just saying, I mean, none of us know the future, but at 5 years from now, it made sense for approving a nuclear plant that needed water. Boy, I hope the commission had that power to do it in those areas that weren't critical groundwater areas. But, so that's it. Did that make sense?
Yeah,
So just like the problem we have with solar.
sure, so let me apologize if I made it sound like we're trying to tie the commission's hands, because the commission is our governing body. And it is not our intent to tell them what to do, and at the end of the day, they adopt these rules, so whatever goes before them, they have to agree to, so we're not trying to do anything underhanded there. What I'm trying to convey is that in certain situations, we have a backlog of groundwater right applications, right, statewide, and we've been beat up on that for years now, because it's been years. It is still possible for people to apply for groundwater rights in areas where we know we are going to deny them, but we have to go through the full process and take staff time to process them, even though we know and we're going to deny them. So if we have the opportunity to work with the commission and say, we're just gonna outright deny the application that is not going to get approved anyway, let's do that. And let's make that clear, and let's take some of that workload away from the staff that is unnecessary and allow them to continue to focus on driving that backlog down. That's what I was trying to convey, John. And
That sounds good.
And I probably did a poor job, but that I'd like to make that clarification. So thank you for raising that issue. Yeah.
The customers wanted to apply to the.
Okay, so action items coming out of
Well,
this.
we have one public comment request, Ken Beerley. yeah.
What do we got?
Sorry
Ken,
for
go
that.
ahead.
Just two quick observations. One is, I have a question in the chat, really. If you identify the entire basin as a single reservoir, will that tie the hands of voluntary agreements? And I think you could think about that offline. Because that term is also used in the voluntary agreement statute. So be careful about that. Second question is, it would be helpful if the revised work plan could be sent out so you could get suggestions on what necessary materials for each one of those decision points might be. Good job. Have a good trip back.
Okay, Brenda, anything from you as far on the discussion group, anything that was left unanswered or? Okay. Okay, so action items, we'll, like I said, get a kind of a more action oriented, this is information back to you soon. So that you can respond to that and we can keep the ball rolling. Anything else that I missed, Tim, Kelly, as far as work between now and the next meeting?
No, I'd just like to say thank you again for a good conversation and for coming to these meetings and paying attention and asking wonderful questions. And thank you for those that attended the model conversation or presentation this morning. Thought the questions were excellent, and I really appreciate that everyone is as engaged as they are. And this isn't an easy process by any means, but I'm thankful for the attitudes in this room.
Yeah, I'll second that too. I think, this was a really good meeting and, really appreciate all the engagement from folks. Let's continue doing that. That's great.
Okay, thank you, everybody.